welcome to this afternoon's sitting of the Education Committee, and I'll just cover the usual issues around housekeeping before we make a start on the agenda. So advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online, and I would advise anyone in the public gallery that they are welcome to use mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode and that all devices are muted. And it's not permitted to take photographs of any part of the meeting or to record any part of the meeting. And I'm just putting my own phone onto the appropriate mode so it doesn't start ringing. That brings us to item 1 on the agenda, which is apologies. I haven't received any apologies. Do any members have any? So the Deputy Chair, Pat, is unable to attend today. No other apologies at this stage other than an apology for lateness from Colin, if that could be noted. Item 2 on the agenda is Chairperson's business. Very, very brief note, really, just I think to note the launch of the curriculum review, which was yesterday afternoon. Now, it happened while we were in a committee session, so I don't think any members were able to attend, but it was really just to note that obviously it's a pretty significant intervention in terms of education policy in Northern Ireland, and I think it would be appropriate to be seeking a briefing on that, and we will be looking to do that hopefully before recess if time permits. I think it would be good to be able to engage with Lucy Crane on that in a bit of detail. Unless anyone's anything to add to that item, it would be item 3, which is declaration of interests. Do any members have any declarations they would need to make at this stage? No. If anything arises on the agenda as normal, if members can just indicate so those can be noted for the record if required. Okay, now in terms of where we're at with the quorum at the moment, so matters arising is covering motions that the committee may want to be bringing in relation to our concurrent committee meeting with the Department for the Economy and in relation to restrictive practice, but we currently only have quorum for evidence taking and not decision making, so we will move that on to later in the agenda for when we do have quorum. But we can then move on to the other items on the agenda. I'll have to leave draft minutes as well, as they will require agreement. We now have quorum, so we'll track back. Okay, so we just got to item 4 on the agenda there. So we have matters arising, which we'll go through at this stage. So the 2 items in matters arising are both motions that the committee is considering bringing to the floor of the Assembly. So the first one, if I refer members to item 4.1, and that is a draft motion on the use of restrictive practices in educational settings. So we have the motion as drafted, which is at page 3 of tabled papers, and then we have a proposed amended motion at page 4 of tabled papers, and that came through from Peter Martin. So look, happy to open up discussion on that. I'll give my view to start with. My view would be very much that I would be in support of bringing forward the motion as was originally drafted. I feel from the evidence that committee has heard and from the discussions that we've had around this issue over our recent evidence session and ones further back in the mandate, and certainly listening to the parental lobby very strongly on this as well, that the repeal of Article 4.1c of the Education Order 1986 is really critical to this, and there did seem to be a concern around how that on the statute book could work with statutory guidance around restrictive practice and how those two things could be balanced. So that would be my position, and I would certainly be of the view that I would be keen to take forward the original motion, but really happy to open up to the floor, perhaps to bring Peter in to speak to his amended motion, and then we can have a discussion from there. So Peter, if you want to speak to that.
That's great, thank you very much, Chair. So we have the amendment down, which more or less follows the original committee motion, but as you'll note, it does not remove 4.1c. It instead then highlights the D Circular 2113, which states that restraint should only be used as a measure of last resort to preserve the dignity and respect of all concerned. It should never be used as a form of punishment or to make a child behave, never deliberately cause pain or injury to a child. All instances of reasonable force restraint should be recorded. Parents and carers should be informed, and follow-up support provided to pupil and staff involved. And it kind of goes on, but that's a sort of key aspect of it. So, Chair, in bringing this amendment, we feel that covers use of force. We've heard examples on the committee previously about some dreadful examples that don't necessarily just conform to 4.1c, which no one would stand over, and I'm sure I'm on record as saying they're appalling. However, 4.1c is important as I think it does provide a level of cover for teachers, and there are lots of very low-level examples of this. Without 4.1c, for example, if a teacher was to put a hand on a child, maybe to make them sit down in terms of maintenance of good order, where would that teacher sit in terms of the law? Placing a hand on a child, perhaps even clearing a corridor or moving two children aside. That does not conform to 4.1a or 4.1b. And then the general principles of just maintaining good order in a classroom, and some of that is just very low level stuff. So we have the amendment. I think it's our view that we would like to hear, and I know in your opening statement you mentioned some views that we have had. Certainly I would be supportive of taking a wider range of stakeholders' views on it. That would certainly include all the unions, certainly include special needs teachers, and to see what they think about the removal of 4.1c. It'd be my view that we haven't had that as much as I would like, to have confidence that teachers are aware of what the ramifications of taking this away would be and where it would leave teachers and principals and boards of governors if it was removed.
No, thank you, Peter. I suppose for me, and I'll just respond and then I'll open up to other members, the concern that I have is that particular phrase, reasonable force. And I think some of those examples you've given about, just placing a hand on a child's shoulder doesn't say to me force. Reasonable force suggests to me a degree of impetus behind that force that I find less than desirable, I think, to be on the statute book in terms of how that could pan out in a classroom. And I'm not trying to suggest any teacher would have malign intent to ever wish to harm a pupil, but I think it is important that what's on our statute book is very clearly worded to be exactly what we want it to achieve, and not something that is making the best of perhaps a form of words we wouldn't write into legislation now. And I would be very clear that statutory guidance on restrictive practice should be able to cover all of those sort of issues that have been raised, and I think that getting that right is the key in my view, and to remove some of the uncertainty around that issue. That would just be my response to your amendment, but I think it's an important conversation to have and to hear. So I just check, are there other members who want to come in on this one at all?
We're content with the two motions as they were. The only thing I'd say here today is just Cara and Colin not being here. I would be my only concern.
Okay, so we've got that they due to join online.
They're due to join online, yeah. Colin did say that they did.
He did, yeah.
Just because it's committee approval.
Yeah, no, in terms of, I think I have no objection to hearing as many views around the table as possible. So, I mean, I'm happy to delay a final decision into the later in the meeting when we've more members attending. David?
I think, first of all, I agree with Peter, and I think in my own discussions just on school visits and so on with any special schools that I've raised it with, there's been a nervousness. There hasn't been I think it'd be misleading to say that there's been a solid opinion, but certainly a nervousness about what that would mean and the grey area it creates for them. On that basis, I would like, probably before coming down on a position, to hear a bit more from those who are living that day in, day out, but also taking on the point that you made around reasonable force. And I understand the word force, it comes with connotations, but it can be interpreted in lesser or greater ways in that sense. I don't know if it's worthwhile, the committee looking or seeking legal advice or interpretation around what exactly force in this instance means and what it covers, and that's maybe something to be thought about. But I just think I'm not coming and saying I have a solid position on this, but I think certainly before I would be comfortable giving a view of wanting to repeal Article 4.1c, I would want to be more sure in my head about where it leaves teachers.
David? Anyone else? Michelle, did you want to come in?
I know this has been probably discussed at the committee longer than I've been at the committee. Have we not had this kind of evidence before around this? Have you had evidence sessions that covered this already, or have we not?
Probably not from the teaching unions. I think that's a fair point. We haven't heard specifically from them on that point.
I'm minded already. I'm persuaded by the conversations we've had on my own that repeal of Article 4.1c is necessary, and that the guidance is what people have expressed to me that they're waiting on. They haven't really raised this with me. They're more concerned that there's a void in the guidance, and I think there's a pressure to get this done, and obviously the intention of this motion is to try and progress this to a conclusion as quickly as possible. I'm nervous about anything that seems to want to protract it. The department have had this for long enough, and I don't want it to be a situation where we are facilitating this not getting done, because it needs to get done.
Yeah, and I think to pick up on that, and I don't want it to drag this out too long, as obviously we're keen to get to evidence sessions as well, but we did have a departmental report that clearly recommended the repeal of that article, which was supported by the previous education minister. So I think it is that sense of not being clear what has really changed in terms of the policy direction from that. My feeling is that the motion as drafted would provide the minister the opportunity to set that out in terms of what his concerns are, and that I think that debate on the floor of the Assembly in and of itself would be a helpful one to understand why those two different ministers have taken a different approach to this issue. So I would be of the view that putting forward the call to repeal Article 4.1c is appropriate. Conscious we don't have Cara or Colin present, I am happy to park the decision on that motion until we have fuller attendance at committee, given it's important that we go forward with consensus wherever that's possible. So if members are agreed, we'll hold the decision on that until we have further attendance. And if members want to make a clear proposal around additional evidence they want to hear, conscious we would be moving into the territory of potentially not getting this on the agenda before recess, so we would have to make a decision if that's what we're comfortable with. But if there's a clear proposal around hearing further evidence from other stakeholders, then we can look at that. But if members are agreed, we'll just hold the decision until we have wider attendance. On the other item of the motion in relation to the concurrent committee, you didn't have any amendments suggested? Do we have any views? I'm very happy to support this going forward in relation to the issues around the 14 to 19 strategy. So our members agreed on that.
I'll just make the same point that they're not there just for the sake of that. We're happy, but just
for the sake of fairness, we'll hold it. But obviously, it is ultimately, and I think on this issue, I'd be keen if we're bringing something to the floor of the Assembly. I'd be keen to have consensus, but it is members' responsibility to be at a meeting on time. So ultimately, yeah. Okay, there is Cara joining us. So Cara, just to fill you in on the conversation, we have been discussing the motions that were tabled. We have an amended motion in relation to restrictive practice, which was received from Peter, and it was agreed that we would wait until we had broader attendance at committee. So as you're joining us now, if would be just to be keen to hear if you have any views in terms of the motion going forward, which specifically recalls for the repeal of Article 4.1c or the amended version from Peter. And I think we're probably in a position, I'm content to say as chair, we are. It is an appropriate juncture here to go forward with a decision. So Cara, is there any particular view you would want to bring forward on that before we come to a decision on this?
From what I have in my notes here, just review, it doesn't seem, I can't really see anything I disagree with. Peter, is there anything you want to speak to it that perhaps I don't know or have missed?
Yeah, so Cara, I'm not sure if you caught the earlier conversation. We had a wee bit of discussion about it. So I was boiled down making the point that the removal of 4.1c could be problematic for teachers in terms of them placing hands on children, moving children aside in a corridor, and other, for what I would call fairly low level examples of of moving children around, and whether or not the removal of 401c particularly would affect teachers and would make teachers very nervous of doing some of that, which would fall into the category of maintenance of good order and discipline, because 401a and 401b only provide for very specific circumstances. So the amendment I've tabled, more or less, it doesn't call for the removal of 401c, but it does go through some of the aspects, and I read those out, that actually it should only be used as a last resort. It should all be recorded. It should never be used as a form of punishment, etc., etc. So you can see that in the amended motion itself. But I suppose my concern was in what if this was agreed, where would that leave teachers? And I made a wider point that I don't think we have heard from teachers' unions a clear position from teachers' unions on this matter. We had a little bit last week, but obviously, as other members of the committee will be aware, they covered quite a lot in a very short space of time, and they just treated that as one small piece. So I would want to hear from, I'd like to hear from all the unions exactly where they are and how they feel, what they think their members' reaction would be if it was removed.
Is it possible for us to postpone like a final vote until we hear from unions? Is that a possibility, or do we have to decide today?
I mean, that's for the committee to decide ultimately. So that would be for the committee to decide. There's no clock ticking on this in any particular way that other than any time scale the committee would want to set for itself. So,
well, I'd be happy to suggest it, I suppose, if it hasn't already, just that we do sort of write to unions if that's possible, and maybe just say, look, we would love a one pager, a summary of your perspective on what we already have, and then on Peter's proposed amendment, if that's possible, and then get their feedback and maybe go from there.
Specific, I mean, that sounds like a formal proposal from Cara there, so that's specific feedback from the unions in relation to the repeal of Article 4.1c. Is that specific issue? Have I understood that correctly, Cara?
Yeah.
Okay, so are you making that as a formal proposal?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think I've made a formal proposal.
There we go, formal proposal.
That's
okay.
possible.
Do members have a view on that proposal, David?
If Cara wouldn't mind, sort of, I wonder whether it would be appropriate to include special schools principals within that as well, just to get that, given that you have the teaching unions obviously very broad, but they will have members in special schools obviously, but a group there that sort of obviously have that particular experience.
There's a group of special schools principals that we can write to. I'd be very keen for them to be consulted on this as well.
So if Cara's content with that,
I'm content. If other members are happy,
conversation that we had. So she's had Peter's perspective, but you also then interject it with your own perspective in terms of having this debate on the floor of the Assembly. That this has already been in front of a previous minister. I think that's probably relevant to Cara's consideration here.
Yeah, so just to clarify, yes, in terms of my perspective on this, I think if we look at particularly the campaign that the committee will be well aware of from Deirdre Shakespeare around Harry's Law, the repeal of Article 4.1c is central to that, and also there has been a departmental report that clearly recommended adopting a suite of recommendations which included repeal of Article 4.1c, which was endorsed and accepted by the previous Education Minister. So I suppose it is for me that sense of really the specific call for repeal is also to try and understand why the current Education Minister has departed from that perspective. Mm-hmm. I am of the view that article does need to be repealed. I don't think it leaves teachers exposed. There's nothing to say that an additional guidance or legislation indeed could be put forward that would provide clarity around all of those issues, and I think around sort of sensible professional guidance is probably acceptable in this space, rather than the need to permit that particular phrase of force. So that is my perspective. Just as Michelle has indicated, you didn't hear that element of the conversation. So, but really it is up to members now in terms of what we want to do. So, yeah. Cara, are you in a position you're bringing a proposal, or has anything changed in your thinking?
Well, I suppose I take your perspective, and I would imagine I probably align more so with yourself, having known Harry's story and with Deirdre. But then I suppose I would also be open to the idea of hearing from teachers' unions, and I think as much consultation as possible, I suppose, is normally the best way forward. But yeah, I'm happy to put it to the floor. If you can even postpone for one more week, just to give teachers and special school principals the opportunity to provide engagement and go from there. But knowing again Harry's story and knowing the horrors that he had to endure, Chair, I think I align with you, but also want to put this proposal to the floor as well,
Okay.
if possible.
Because you're saying real time frames, but we know how tight we are with the uniform bill in this here, and it's just, look, if we're going to bring forward, for me, the committee said of it, the two motions were there. If you were going to do it, like, we'll have to be realistic. This is going to end up being September onwards then, if and not longer. So I think that before anything's decided, that we have to be real about it as well.
So if we were to move forward with asking for feedback, then this might be a question for the clerk, from trade unions, for example, or special school principals, would that delay decision making by a significant amount of time? Would it be looking at September, or what would that look like?
Well, you would want to give people a week to 10 days at the very least to reply, or you would want to maybe invite them to an informal meeting on Tuesday morning, something like that. So yeah, you're talking about a week. A committee motion normally takes about 2 weeks to get from here through the business committee and onto the schedule. So just, you I guess you risk not being able to debate it before the summer if you delay it.
Yeah, okay. Given
it's on balance, I can't say for definite, but it is a risk.
Knowing that the timeline aspect, I suppose recess is catching up on us, and I can't believe it's June already. But again, is it possible where, yeah, I guess not. You sort of have to weigh up your odds there. I don't know if, David, you want to come in?
I mean, I'm not looking to sort of your consideration of it. I would just say if it's important to hear the views of teachers for what is a fairly significant proposal, it's important to hear the views of teachers for the proposal. I mean, teachers are ultimately going to be the people who, as well as the children, and I just want to put on record, I'm no less harrowed by Harry's story and some of the stuff that's come forward. This is not in any way taking away from that experience, and I understand that there will come from some frustration. It's a very sensitive topic, and I think each time it's come up, the chair will know that I have said it's one that I don't think any of us probably feel completely comfortable on, but certainly I have not felt that I don't have that lived experience on either side, and feel it's a difficult thing to come to a conclusion on. But I do think it's important to hear teachers' views and those of special schools principals. It's important to hear it, even if that means, I don't think this should be something we come to in haste, I guess is what I'm saying. But yes, just to say as well, the evidence we've heard from some of us being absolutely harrowing, and I'm in agreement with that. It's just about coming to the right decision around this.
Keen to bring it to a conclusion. So we'll hear from Danny, and then I'll maybe sum up where we're at.
It is it's a decision for the minister at the end of the day. Is motions are for to be debated. If people want to contact us, like any motion that you bring through, you can be lobbied, I suppose. So I think we've heard an abundance of evidence, if I'm being brutally honest. But
I mean, I'm of the view that time is against us, that we have heard plenty of evidence, that we did hear from the teaching unions last week who confirmed that they had no issue around the repeal of Article 4.1c, but we do have a proposal on the floor. So if that is going forward, could I perhaps suggest that if we are writing teaching unions for advice, that we make it clear that we are seeking a quick turnaround, and if we don't have advice by a certain date, we will proceed, because we are
I think that's a happy medium.
Assembly timing. So that would be my suggestion if we're going down that route, but I'll open it up. It's for members to decide. So the proposal on the floor is to seek evidence or a view from the teaching unions in relation to the repeal of Article 4.1c. So are members agreed on that or not?
In a time-bound manner, would that be the sort of language that we'd be using, Chair?
I think I would be
just
strongly suggesting we do that.
With my only fear would be with the timeline aspect. So if we're using language of urgency and really, talking about how significant this is, I would be happy to vote yes for that.
Sorry, Chair, would we be suggesting that this comes back next week?
I think that would be my suggestion.
Would we have time then to try and get this tabled if it comes back next week?
We would. I think next week would give us time. So
Yeah.
I would hope the unions would have a position agreed.
Yeah.
So my suggestion would be that we bring this back for a final decision next week based on receipt of any information from the teaching unions. That correspondence is going to need to go out fairly urgently, and suggest it may need to go out as
Sorry,
We're doing
Amy.
that already. We're doing that
yeah,
already.
doing it
that's
already.
Okay.
So we have agreement. I think it is important to note that certainly, a lot of parents who've been impacted by this do follow this committee, and I think it's important that they understand the committee's commitment to actually dealing with this in a way that is meaningful for them. So and I hope that we are able to move quickly, but that we have agreement on that point. On the second motion, just it's very briefly, David.
It's just whether there is. I'm happy to propose it if necessary. There is, if people feel there is any worth in seeking legal advice around what exactly the term reasonable force means in law. Because the concern I have is, and I understand that the word force has particular connotations, but I don't necessarily think that we should be making decisions around legislation based on the fact that we don't like the sound of a word.
I think to be clear from my perspective, we're not legislating here. We're bringing a non-binding motion for debate, and if the minister wants to bring advice from his department forward in the course of that debate, he can do so. I wouldn't. I think if we go down the route of legal advice, we're kicking this into the long grass.
Well, given it's non-binding, I know that, but that's fair enough.
Okay, that is fine. On the second motion, which is on the concurrent, the follow-up from the concurrent meeting of the Education and Economy Committees, are we agreed that is to go forward? Agreed? Agreed. So that will be submitted to the Economy Committee and then on to the Business Committee, Business Office from there. Okay, apologies, that took longer than anticipated. So draft minutes then is item 5 in the agenda. Few to go through. Draft minutes of the Education meeting of the 27th of May at page 8. And I then also have draft minutes of the Education Committee meeting of the 28th of May at page 12. Can I get members' agreement that they are content that those are a complete and accurate record of proceedings? We agreed? Thank you. Okay, that moves us on to item 6. Some with apologies to our witnesses for the delay in timing there. You got to see committee business in full flow there. So item 6 is a briefing on the School Uniforms Guidelines and Allowances Bill, and it's an oral briefing from the Competition and Markets Authority. Draw members' attention to the clerk's cover note, page 20, and the CMA's response to the Department of Education School Uniform Policy Consultation, which is at page 8 of your tabled papers. So you're both very welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Purpose of today's briefing is to help members understand the role of the CMA in advising the department, particularly in relation to the issue of the price cap, but in matters relating to the school uniform bill more generally, and to explore any relevant market issues that would be under the remit of the CMA with the witnesses. So joining us today we have Gavin Thompson, the Director of Advocacy, Nations and External Relations with the Competition and Markets Authority, and Louise Close, the Northern Ireland representative for the Competition and Markets Authority. So you are very welcome. Again, apologies for the delay in getting your evidence session started. The structure today will be any initial presentation or opening remarks that you wish to make. Obviously, we have your consultation response, which I think covers your views fairly comprehensively, but obviously we now have a bill in front of us which you may want to speak to directly. We would ask any contribution to be up to 10 minutes in length, and then we'll move into a session of question and answer. We try and keep each inquiry from each member to around 5 minutes per inquiry, so it's really getting to the nub of the issue as quickly as we can. And again, we do have 3 evidence sessions today, members, in the interest of getting through the bill scrutiny. So just ask everyone to be succinct in terms of getting to their questions. But at that stage, really, I'll hand over to yourselves and we can go from there.
Great, thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. The Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA, does welcome the opportunity to engage with the committee and to help to contribute to your considerations on the School Uniform Bill. As the Chair noted, I'm Louise Close, I'm the Nations representative, and I'm here today with Gavin Thompson, who's the Director of Advocacy and Political Engagement. Before I hand over to Gavin, who is the expert in this area, I just wanted to kind of give you a bit more of a background on the work of the CMA, what we do, how we do it, and what we're actually doing here in Northern Ireland, because it may be relevant to other committees as well that you're working in. The CMA is an independent non-ministerial government department. It's the principal competition and consumer authority in the UK, and its role is to promote competitive markets and tackling unfair behaviour. Our remit covers the whole of the UK, and in recent years we've increased our presence in the various nations. And the Belfast office in particular has grown rapidly, and that's really helped to raise the profile of the CMA in Northern Ireland. But as importantly, it's helped to raise the kind of unique consumer and market situation that we have here in Northern Ireland to the teams that are working on policy development. And I just wanted to note the support that we get from the executive departments, particularly Trading Standards and the Consumer Council as well. We've seen an increase in stakeholder engagement over the last number of years, and a wide range of areas, from green heating, the private rental sector, vets, so a wide range of markets where we're looking to see what's happening within those markets and if consumers are being protected. So, as I'm sure you'll agree, the competition works well when everybody benefits. Our ambition is to promote an environment where people can be confident that they're getting great choices and fair deals, which I think will resonate with what the committee's looking at in terms of the school uniforms bill, and also a competitive, fair dealing business environment as well, so businesses can thrive. So it's finding the balance, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those things today. We do this through a wide range of functions. So we protect people through addressing unfair trading practices. We investigate markets where we think there's competition or consumer problems. We look at mergers as well, in case there's potentially leads to the lessening of competition. And we take action against businesses who are taking part in cartel activity or anti-competitive behaviour. We also provide information and advice to people and businesses about their rights and obligations. And finally, we provide advice, reporting and monitoring in relation to the UK internal market and government subsidies through the Office of the Internal Market and the Subsidy Advice Unit. So we've got quite a lot of different functions within the CMA. But a key part of our role and why we're here today is to inform and advise governments and legislatures, including the Northern Ireland Executive and the Assembly, to ensure that the impact of competition and competition and consumers is considered in policy making. And we do this formally through responses to consultations, which you've seen are one for the school uniforms policy, and informally through ad hoc engagement. And Gavin will tell you a little bit about our advocacy work in a moment. I would encourage the committee to contact us if you have any concerns related to consumer or markets issues in Northern Ireland. You can contact me directly. I'll share details with the clerk afterwards. I'm based in Belfast. And there's also an email as well that you can email with concerns that we respond to, a bit like a written question to a department here. So please do reach out to us if you have any concerns. And I'll pass to Gavin now.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks to the committee members for the opportunity to speak to you today. So Louise has explained what the CMA does. We've got a wide range of functions, but they're sort of built around this core statutory objective of promoting competition for the benefit of consumers. Why do we have that objective? It's because when you've got effective competition, when you've got firms competing to deliver good value, when you've got confident consumers making choices in their best interests, good things tend to happen. That rivalry between firms means they're more responsive to consumers. Prices get driven down, quality is driven up, you might get innovation, a greater range of choice and so on. And one of the ways, as Louise says, we look at the CMA to promote competition is providing advice and support to government, including in the devolved administrations. And the reason we do that is because government, through its policies and activities, can affect competition both positively and negatively. And so if we see an opportunity for government to harness the benefits of competition, we might approach them. If we see policy being made that might affect how markets work, we might reach out and support policy officials in thinking through those options. But it's not our job to make policy. It's not our job to question policy objectives. We're very much in the space of advising and informing, and governments can ultimately take or leave our advice as they see fit. So that's our sort of locus and remit in general terms. For school uniforms specifically, this is something we've taken a close interest in over the years because it's a good example of how policies and decisions by public authorities, in this case schools, can affect competition and how that then feeds through into the prices paid by consumers or parents and carers in this case. I mean, the market for generic school uniform items is pretty competitive, right? So plain shirts, plain jumpers, plain trousers. There's lots of suppliers, including the major supermarkets. There's a good choice offer, a range of kind of quality to suit people's preferences. But to put it plainly, schools can turn a competitive market into a monopoly through their uniform policies when they require uniform items to be purchased through a single supplier or direct from the school itself. And even when they're not insisting on a single supplier, if they're insisting on lots of specially branded items, those items are likely to be costlier to make and competition to supply them will be more limited. So there's a pretty mechanical relationship between those policy decisions by schools and the prices and costs borne by parents. And bear those costs, they must. Uniforms aren't a discretionary purchase. They're like your mortgage, your water, your electricity, but demand is pretty inelastic, to use the economic jargon. Incidentally, I met a representative from the Consumer Council Northern Ireland earlier today, and they handed over me their household expenditure tracker showing that half of Northern Ireland households have less than £112 discretionary income per week. So if you've got uniform policies that lead to parents paying over the odds, it's going to take a significant chunk out of that. So we've engaged quite closely over the years with policy in Wales, Scotland, England. I can talk about that if that's of interest to the committee. In the interest of time, I'll speak a bit about the bill, our engagement with the Department of Education here in Northern Ireland. We've been really, really glad to support and inform officials' thinking here as they've developed their consultation. Of course, we responded publicly to that. You'll see we didn't explicitly advise against a cost cap. What we did in that response was draw on our experience of price caps in other contexts and apply that to the proposal laid out in the consultation and in the bill. And I can talk a bit more about our thinking here as well, if that's of interest. And then on the bill itself, it obviously reflects quite closely the proposals made in the consultation. It won't surprise you to hear that we strongly support the overall objective of bringing down the cost of the uniform through statutory guidance that deals with affordability. Assembly members will sort of need to decide how far to sort of dictate the contents of that guidance through the primary legislation before them. I will probably resist being drawn too much on that. It sort of goes to the balance between the Assembly and the Executive. It's not really right for me to opine on that. From the CMA's perspective, we'd obviously hope that affordability remains a central objective of the guidance, for the guidance to address the features of school uniform policies that drive high costs, so particularly branded items, exclusive supplier arrangements, and for it to be straightforward both to comply with for schools and to enforce. And as part of that, we think that provisions in Clause 3 of the bill that enable the guidance to cap the number of branded items within a uniform, a sensible, straightforward measure that align with the approach being taken forward in England through the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. Your consultation response was very comprehensive, so it's given us a lot to work with. I wanted just to ask on, we referenced other jurisdictions first before we look at the Northern Ireland specific scenario. So you've been involved in providing advice around school uniform policy, and particularly with the legislation that went through in England and now the new legislation that's making its way through Parliament. In terms of the legislation that was originally went through in England, which was it was statutory guidance with not much else associated with it, do you have any assessment of how effective that was in terms of making a real impact on school uniform cost?
So it's not something that the CMA has itself tracked. I know that the Department for Education did a survey of the cost of uniforms, which I think looked at compared the cost paid by parents in 2023 with 2015. I don't know if you've seen that. That showed that school uniform prices had fallen modestly in real terms, so adjusting for inflation. It's difficult to pick out from that what the impact of the guidance is versus other kind of general trends. So we can't say for sure that the guidance had that effect. I guess the other thing to have in mind is that different jurisdictions have taken a different approach to exactly both how the guidance is specified and how it's sort of framed in the legislation. So I think for England, there's a have regard clause, so the schools must have regard to it. I think the language of the bill before the Assembly is must adhere, which is obviously stronger. And then in terms of the content of the guidance, I think Wales, if you look at that appears to be a bit stronger in terms of the sort of restrictions it places on schools with respect to branded items. I think they say no branded items should be compulsory, which is quite strong. Whereas England, I think, has other language from memory. It's that they should be kept, branded items should be kept to a minimum. So there are differences both in the content of the guidance and the kind of the obligations placed on schools through the primary legislation.
I suppose then to move on to that issue of branded items in particular, from the CMA's perspective, would your advice be that some sort of limit on branded items is an effective intervention, and does that have any potential negative consequences?
So it's something that we suggested to the Department of Education when we were engaging with them on the consultation as a measure that could potentially sit alongside or instead of cost caps. It has its attractions because it goes to the root cause of why uniform costs are high, which is those branded items. I think it feels like it would be relatively simple to comply with as well. I guess the downside is that you may get schools kind of clustering around that limit, so that if it's a limit of 4, then they will all just have that limit of 4 and there's no incentive to go beneath it. And potentially also that those branded items will be the most expensive ones within that kind of that item cap. But I think that goes to the point that the sort of the restriction on the number of branded items should sit alongside other bits of the guidance that deal with affordability, right? And they should work in parallel rather than being sort of substitutes for each other.
And in terms of the legislation that's under consideration now in England around numbers of items, in terms of your advice on that, had you been supportive of that?
We've not provided specific advice to the Department of Education on the provisions in that bill, but broadly we're supportive of measures that look to kind of cap the overall number of branded items that the schools apply in their uniform policy. Given
that the specific clause 3 in the bill here, which looks at capping the number of, or a limit on specific styles, I think is the phrase used in clause 3. Would you have a view in terms of whether or not it is helpful that is just creates an enabling power, or do you think for delivering an effective intervention that to just make that happen would be a more direct way to approach it?
I mean, I think that is going to that balance between what's baked into the primary versus what's in the guidance. That isn't something I think that we can necessarily come to a kind of well-informed view from the perspective of the CMA on, so I probably won't be drawn on that if that's okay, Chair.
No, I understand that there's a balance there to be struck from your organisation's perspective. We're struggling a little bit on some aspects of the bill because we don't know what's going to be in the guidelines, and we are being told by the department that we definitely should trust them and it will be okay. But it does make it difficult to know how prescriptive we would wish to be in the bill when we don't know what the guidelines that are emerging out of it at the other end are going to look like. If I could just move briefly then on to the idea of a price cap, and then I'll bring other members in. So I think your written evidence sets out some of your concerns around that. Would you again have a view in terms of there is an enabling power in the bill to put a limit on the cost, the total costs of a uniform, but it is an enabling power? Given its potential complexity, which you have highlighted in your evidence, if the committee was to be considering an amendment around making that something that, again, the department just takes away, do you feel that would require further consultation, wider engagement with stakeholders, or would there be enough of an understanding of the impact that would have on the market to just go ahead and introduce a cap?
I think you probably, there are quite a lot of considerations to take into account when it comes to a cost cap, and
can you maybe summarise those I think for the purpose of the record that would be helpful.
I mean, I think it broadly boils down to sort of setting the level of the cap. What level do you set it at, and how do you adjust it over time? There's compliance, so how do schools themselves and the department ensure that they're abiding by the cap? There's the incentives to think about, so what might be the response of schools and suppliers to the cost cap, and is that consistent with what you're trying to achieve? And I think underpinning all of those is the kind of the question of resources. Is the resource there to ensure that cap works effectively, to adjust it, to enforce it, to monitor the impact, and so on? And I think those considerations apply slightly differently. We can get into this maybe further down the track, depending on how you design the cap, really, and whether it's a sort of an all-in cost of the uniform, in which case compliance is quite hard because which number do you use for the cost of a pair of generic trousers when monitoring compliance with the cap, versus caps on specific branded items, like a blazer, in which case the challenge is more kind of assessing, well, what is a fair price for that item of clothing, and you need to look potentially at input costs and fair margins and things like that. So I think there are a range of considerations, and depending on what you want to do with the cap and how broad you want to apply it, those considerations will apply with different force.
And that's helpful observations. In terms of what we heard from retailers, they were quite clear in their evidence that the market can fluctuate, and you may be able to bring things in cheaper one year than you are in the previous. Is there an issue with setting the cap that you could miss out on the benefit of prices coming down? Is that a genuine concern? It was certainly floated by the retailers as an issue.
I think it potentially is, particularly if you're doing an item by item cap, so then you're really kind of in the territory of potentially having to monitor input costs and adjust them downwards, and you might not be doing that, with sufficient alacrity over time that you're kind of capturing the benefits of falls in input costs as well as rises. But then the more frequently you adjust it, then that kind of creates potential compliance burdens for schools at the same time, who are constantly having to kind of verify whether their uniform policy is consistent.
If I've understood correctly, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm genuinely not trying to do that in this instance. So we've been looking forward to your evidence to get the input on this, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. Have I understood correctly that you're saying that a price cap on the sort of a total uniform from start to finish, PE kit, everything, is more difficult? So putting a cap on that is more difficult than potentially on branded items. So have I understood that correctly?
I think it raises slightly different challenges.
Okay.
I think that the all-in instinctively, because there's not really any other jurisdictions that we're drawing on here, instinctively an all-in cost of uniform cap could pose compliance challenges for schools and the Department of Education in terms of assessing whether schools are complying, simply because for the generic items that form part of that overall cap, the price varies a lot. So what number do you use for assessing your compliance with the cap? That would seem to me to be the most significant consideration and challenge for an all-in cap.
Okay. Well, thank you. Final question. You had suggested in your consultation that the department could consider a one-time or short-term intervention with the cap. Can you just speak to that to help us understand how that might operate and what the thinking behind that suggestion was?
So I suppose if you're trying to kind of achieve a one-off change, okay, let me try and rephrase that. I think what you're doing with a cap is, rather than relying on a kind of general principle of affordability in your guidance and saying schools need to consider affordability, you're specifying what affordability means in pounds and pence terms and saying this is what we think affordability means. And so if you're concerned that schools don't have a good sense of what affordability looks like, then maybe a cap can set a signal to them. This is what we mean by that principle. And so, you could imagine a temporary cap helping to send that signal to schools, and therefore, having withdrawn it afterwards, they then have a kind of clear understanding of what is meant by that principle.
Thank you. I'm happy to open up to other members. So Danny, I think, Kathy, Michelle, and we'll see who else comes in. Okay, so Danny. Yeah.
Peter, thank you. And just going back to the branded items and capping, we had great presentations yesterday from our young people, and one of the students who just happened to be in front of us, sitting right there, had 3 branded items. It was the tie, the jumper, and the blazer, and very quickly ascertained that she doesn't participate in sports because everything's branded, and goes to school having to take off her coat and walk another 10 minutes in the freezing cold and getting soaking because she would be punished for having that. So see, for us collectively to bring down the cost, do we have to look at all of this, like it all has a wee piece of a puzzle, including that of gender neutrality as well? Because another point was made that you can't even be sustainable and hand down even a blazer, for example, if it's different sex in the house, you can't hand it down from a brother to a sister or vice versa. So do we really need to look at all of it in an equality and rights based as well, if we really want to bring down the price of uniforms here?
So I think we certainly need to look at PE kits as well, and they need to be taken as part of the overall uniform. Of course, from the CMA's perspective, the principle that we're kind of most anxious about reflecting our statutory remit is affordability. But of course, there are other important principles when it comes to uniform that you know the committee members will need to consider, and that the bill may need to reflect.
If you only had 3 branded items, or even 4, say, that's the compulsory. That would deal with PE gear as well. So that is going to drive down the cost with other measures that if they're taken. Would that be correct?
Relative to a situation where a school had more than that number of branded items in their policy, then you would expect it to result in lower uniform costs. Yeah. So if the school's currently has 4 compulsory branded items for its main uniform and 4 for its PE uniform, and you cut
I'm
that.
saying 4 in general, though.
Yeah.
If you were just to set it and was capped at 4, say.
4.
I'm just picking that number out. I know the Westminster one was actually contemplating 3 at one stage, the drafted one. But would that drive down the cost with other than measures?
To the extent that that schools require more than that number of branded items in their policies, then it will drive down. We'd expect it to drive down those costs. Yeah.
So it is clear that there's quite a number of schools that are very cost effective, and they're very practical. But then you have an element there that's probably then masked by the good behaviour that are just extortionate, and then it's excluding children from. It's a barrier to education, but it's excluding certain children from their school really, and are excluding them from sports. So I suppose it's just it's fitting all of that into it, I suppose, to get that cost down. No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation. As others have mentioned, we heard evidence yesterday from, young people, but there was a parent here as well. And one thing that would seem to come through very strongly was about girls' uniforms being much more expensive. Is that something that you have picked up on? Is that something that you have seen?
It's not something that we've kind of monitored or observed, but we don't. Our role isn't to kind of examine individual schools' uniform policies and kind of assess the relative costs. But I mean, if that's what the committee's heard, then I've no reason to doubt that.
Okay. Then just another issue that was raised, and was actually through suppliers that were in front of us, who mentioned around the older pupils' uniforms, once you go above a certain age, that has VAT then attached to it. Now I know that that's not something we have any control or any power on here, but is that something that you are aware of or have had given any advice on? Or
we don't typically advise on fiscal policy and tax policy, but I think one of the arguments that's sometimes made against cutting VAT is that the benefits of that aren't passed on to end consumers, that they're sort of captured in the form of profits by suppliers. To the extent that the market for school uniform items isn't competitive, then you would expect that more of that VAT cut will be held onto by suppliers rather than passed on to end consumers. Whereas if the market was more competitive, you'd expect that companies and suppliers would be more incentivised to pass that tax cut on. So I think the impact of a tax change like that will slightly depend on the level of competition in the market and to an extent on whether it's applied to branded items or unbranded.
And then just finally, because some of us represent more rural constituencies, and it's having that balance. You know, we've heard stories and rumours of, you know, there maybe just being one supplier in a small rural village, or where there might be 2 suppliers, sweetheart deals and things like that between a school and a supplier as well. Is this something you have a view on, and trying to balance that actually? They're being in those more rural areas as well? Yeah,
so I think in our consultation, I think we acknowledge that for small schools in rural areas, it might not be practicable to have multiple suppliers of their particular uniform, because there just aren't, you know, that many of those uniform items being produced every year. So it may be that an exclusive supplier arrangement, time limited, is the best way of getting the best deal for those schools. What we would say or would expect is for that arrangement to be looked at and reviewed regularly and potentially put out to competitive tender where it can be, to ensure that that schools and parents are getting the best value for those branded items. Yeah, sorry, no, I'll leave there.
Thank you, Kathy. Michelle, you'd indicated next.
Thank you, folks, for the evidence so far. I just have a quick point of clarity at the start, just for my own understanding of your role in this. So you've said that this isn't a competitive market as it is. There are consumer laws to protect consumers from competitive practices. So what has your role been to date in terms of schools and unfair practices? You're responding to this legislation, but have you done anything, or have you been proactive around this at all?
So just to clarify the point on competitive markets, I think I would say that there is a competitive market for generic uniform items, but schools, when they insist on branded items, can effectively create a market that is less competitive for parents to shop from because they've got less choice and there's less competition. So part of our role has been to advise government on policy that can help to address that and can help to limit the extent to which schools apply those policies. Competition law is also relevant here to an extent. So obviously agreements between suppliers to fix prices are prohibited in competition law. If there are penalties for that, if there's evidence of that, we want to see it. If suppliers are insisting that retailers sell their products at a particular price, that's generally a breach of competition law too. We're interested in that. And then long-term exclusive supply arrangements might be problematic from a competition law perspective because they put those suppliers in a dominant position, and suppliers in a dominant position have special responsibilities under competition law. And if they abuse that position by charging excessive prices, there's a potential breach of competition law there. We wrote in 2015, we wrote an open letter to all schools in England, advising them of their responsibilities under competition law and advising them that exclusive supply arrangements of a long duration could lead to an abuse of dominance under competition law, and for them to review their arrangements with that in mind. We haven't taken any further legal steps in that regard because we haven't seen specific evidence of infringements of competition law.
Okay. To pick up on the exclusive agreements aspects again, so you've spoken about exclusive agreements between single suppliers and schools, but you've also raised the issue of, I guess, de facto exclusive arrangements because of design requirements of the uniforms. Could you just give us a bit more detail on how you think the design, those two aspects, the design and the exclusive contracts between schools, to ensure the fair competition happens?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that so where schools mandate a particular design or particular brand, that is kind of mechanically going to limit competition and choice for parents because they can't get those items from supermarkets or other retailers. So you've already got a sort of a less competitive market. And I think what the exclusive supply arrangements do then is if schools are saying, contracting with retailers in such a way that those retailers have exclusive rights to sell that item, other retailers can't enter the market, that's almost another way in which competition is being limited even further. So it's kind of adding insult to injury, as it were, from a competition perspective. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the outwork on that is then exclusive supplier contracts or something we want to see an end to or restrict? Or?
I think unless there is strong reasons from a kind of cost efficiency perspective for those arrangements to be in place, then I think the presumption would be that they shouldn't be. Yeah.
And final question, because we've talked about branded items quite a bit, in terms of the legislation as it is now, what would your understanding of the term brand be in that legislation?
I'm not sure that the legislation uses the term specific styles, doesn't it? And then it goes on to define that as particular makes or brands or particular logos, unique combinations, colours, fabrics. I don't have a view on that definition. I think when we talk about brands in the context of school uniforms, it's sort of, it doesn't mean what everybody else understands by that term, does it? Because most people think of brands as kind of sports logos and things. Whereas I think we're thinking about things that kind of signify or mark out the school and therefore make it hard to access that product from elsewhere. And sometimes I understand those two things can interact. So with PE kits, you might get two kinds of branding. You might get the school brand, but then also a sportswear brand on top of that. And both elements are compulsory, so you're kind of limiting choice twice over.
Just on that, if there was to be anything more specific done around limiting branded items on the face of the bill, would you say that definition of branding, so that we're clear on what we're talking about, would need to be crystal clear for it to be effective?
You would want things, you would want terms to be as clear as possible if they're going to be in primary legislation, right? And you'd want them to be consistent with what you're looking to achieve from a policy perspective.
Finding that phrase that
yes,
differentiates
that captures
a company
all
brand
the,
with a school brand,
yes,
effectively.
Yeah.
Okay. Just one really quick thing, just again to pick up from Kathy and Michelle's questioning. In the scenario where the school is the only supplier, and we see this a lot with sportswear, that's a very common practice, that PE kits are often only made available through the school. Are there any particular duties that would kick in around competition law for schools there in terms of ensuring that they are delivering the best value for money for consumers, and that widening that arrangement out could be of benefit to consumers?
So I think schools would need to evaluate if they're selling and only allowing their uniform items to be sold through their own shop, whether they are in a dominant position in that market, which they may well be, and then in that case they do have special responsibilities under competition law not to abuse that position, and one of those responsibilities is not to charge excessive prices, although the definition of excessive prices is very kind of case and fact specific and quite complicated. So
we do, and you'll be familiar with those cases where there's been a suggestion that the school charges a certain price for an item but gets a trade-off benefit in terms of maybe kit for staff or other equipment being provided to the school, which schools are in tight budgets, they maybe that's seen as a benefit, but it's not very transparent. And could there be interactions with competition law there that, I mean, I'm not aware of any school publicly having fallen foul of that, but it seems that this bill may be an opportunity to try and address some of those.
It would be hard to say without knowing the very particular facts of each case. I mean, I think incentives paid to schools as part of an agreement with suppliers, whether that's free uniform items or whatever, are ultimately likely to represent a subsidy from parents to those schools, right? Because they are going to be reflected in higher prices for those items that parents purchase. So yeah, I mean, it's ultimately a kind of policy question how far you want to kind of close off any possibility of those kinds of arrangements. I'm struggling to see a competition and consumer rationale for them.
That's helpful. David, you'd indicated.
Sure. I thought it was interesting you were talking about whether the school is in a dominant position in that. I would have said they have a fairly captive audience in terms of their who they're selling to in that regard. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. So pricing leakage in within your written evidence here. Just could explain that a bit further in terms of it reads that suppliers may try to recoup the costs of, if there's a price cap, they may try to recoup costs if they're having to sell a lower price. Are we talking like postage packaging, or what are we talking about? What methods would a supplier who's trying to recoup some of those costs be using?
I think we're drawing on our kind of experience of price caps in other settings where there's a sort of commercial incentive to kind of capture a bit more value by add-on fees, or kind of cross-selling of ancillary stuff, or so. I mean, I'm struggling to think of an example of how that might manifest itself in the school uniforms context, but certainly postage and packaging, or you kind of...
You're selling something at the cheapest rate, but you're charging a tenner for it to be delivered.
Exactly. Yeah. And it just goes to that point that, if you cap the price as something below, you know, what the market will pay for it, then you are going to get those incentives to find a way around it. Yeah.
Therefore, even if you had a sort of hard edge cap on things, there would be ways in which probably schools could point to suppliers that, well, technically they sell this at a particular price and it's available at that price. Whether it's available in the quantity required or whatever may be an issue, but it's available at that price, and therefore they can use that product. But in reality, it may well be that most people are going to have to pay more for it than perhaps that. There's that possibility.
That is a risk, yeah. I guess the other risk with capping individual items is you kind of get a clustering effect around that cap, so that it might have been capable of being sold at a lower price. But
well, that was going to be one of the next questions, actually, because I think you do talk about that, about setting if you're going to have a cap, and whether that's sensible, you know, setting the right price, because there will be a sort of tendency probably for everyone to see that as a target, rather than you were saying that, you know, price fixing and so on. That's not, I imagine, particularly when you're talking about, you know, relatively moderate sort of variations, I guess, in prices, that if it does become a target, I imagine that kind of thing can be quite hard to prove, you know, where
and the competition law,
there might not even be a formal arrangement.
Exactly, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's the anti-competitive agreement that represents the infringement of competition law. If there's a kind of a tacit kind of sort of drifting towards the cap without agreement between undertakings, that's unlikely to be a breach. It's just a kind of side effect of having the cap in place.
And is there many other areas that you're aware of where a figure has been put in primary legislation for caps?
A pounds and pence number, not one that I can think of. No, I think the more typical approach, if anything is put in primary legislation, is to put the uprating in, so you will have kind of a kind of figure that's then uprated by a measure of inflation, for instance, over time, and that measure of inflation might be baked into the legislation. But I think it would be, I can't think of any examples. I'm sure there are of pounds and pence caps in the primary.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, David. Any other indications, Peter? Was that an indication?
No, I'm okay. David asked one of my questions.
And just checking for members online, if anybody's looking to come in. I know Colin was having some issues with audio, so I don't know if he was able, via the clerk, to submit a question. But Cara, are you looking to come in there?
No, Chair, my question's already been answered, but thank you. Thank you to the panel.
And anything through from Colin?
Nothing through from Colin, but maybe for completeness we could just send by correspondence the remainder of the questions in the pack.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But there were a range of other questions that were highlighted as suggested questions, which again I think would all be helpful to hear from if you're happy to follow up on written correspondence
so, indeed, yes.
on those. So.
And as I said at the start, if there are other information you want to send through to the CMA around this issue or others, do contact us. I'll send that through, my details through the clerk. Great.
Much appreciated. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest, as we have with other evidence sessions on the bill, that we collate any actions arising or any particular follow-ups when we've concluded our evidence sessions this afternoon. So we'll do that at the end if members are content with that. So we're just doing a changeover now for the next oral briefing. So if the next witness is available to come forward, that takes us on to item 7 on the agenda. Further briefing on the School Uniforms Guidelines and Allowances Bill, and it's an oral briefing from Parenting Focus. So I would refer members to the clerk's cover note at page 25 and the response from Parenting Focus to the Department of Education School Uniform Policy Consultation, which is at page 27 of your packs. So very happy to welcome Emma Hitchin here today from Parenting Focus, who is the Senior Participation and Research Officer with Parenting Focus. And again, we'll be having a session to look at parents' experiences and the input that Parenting Focus can bring in terms of understanding parents' views on these issues around affording and maintaining school uniforms and any particular perspectives from Parenting Focus on the bill. So you're very welcome. As with other sessions at committee, it'll be an opening presentation or opening remarks up to 10 minutes, and then we will move into question and answer from there. So really over to you at this stage.
Thank you. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of Parenting Focus, a charity committed to representing the voice and experience of parents across Northern Ireland. Our work is rooted in listening to families, what they're telling us about the pressures they face and the support that they require. And school uniforms have long been one of those issues, not because of the cost alone, but because of what uniforms say about how our children are seen and valued in our education system. In 2024, Parent in Focus conducted an online consultation and focus group with over 600 parents and carers in response to the Department of Education's review of school uniform policy. Their message was clear. School uniforms need to be more affordable, more inclusive and more reflective of the reality of children and families and what they live with every day. Cost was the most consistent concern. Parents described branded items that could only be bought from one supplier, mandatory PE kits that cost more than sportswear in retail shops, and requirements that placed an especially heavy burden on those with multiple children or children attending post-primary, especially grammar schools. Many families found themselves struggling, especially those on low incomes who do not qualify for any kind of assistance. One parent told us, "I don't qualify for the uniform grant, but I still can't afford what the school is asking. I'm choosing between school shoes and the electric bill." But affordability is only part of the picture. Parents also raise serious concerns about how uniform policies impact children's rights, comfort, identity and inclusion. Uniforms should never create a barrier to participation or a source of distress, yet too often rigid and outdated policies are doing just that. Furthermore, we believe a clear and standardised definition of what constitutes a school uniform should be included in the statutory guidance. Parents told us that there's confusion and inconsistency, not just between schools but within schools, over whether things like coats, bags, hairstyles or personal grooming choices are considered part of the school uniform policy. We would like to see guidance strengthened on the personal expression, including policies around haircuts, hairstyles, piercings, makeup and facial hair. Uniforms should foster inclusion but not conformity. Consultation with parents and pupils around these elements is vital, and we're calling for clarity so that parents know exactly what is expected and what is optional. We heard from parents of children with sensory processing issues, where children were being disciplined for not wearing itchy or tight garments that they physically couldn't tolerate. We heard from families who wanted their children to be able to wear clothing in line with their gender identity, but who felt stigmatised or excluded because of restrictive policies. We want to emphasise the importance of age-appropriate uniform. In the early years in primary school, uniforms should support play, movement and comfort, not restrict it. A play-based curriculum requires clothing that allows children to climb, sit cross-legged, explore outdoors and participate in physical learning. In post-primary school, especially for girls, the design of school uniform can have a major impact on participation in physical activity. We know that the discomfort and modesty concerns in impractical clothing are major deterrents to teenage girls taking part in PE. Uniform policy should be an enabler and not a barrier. We believe all uniform policy should be based on comfort and practicality and should be gender neutral in both design and language. Children should be able to choose what works best for them regardless of gender. Uniforms should also accommodate cultural and religious dress and should include flexibility around fabric and fit for disabled children or those with medical conditions. Section 75 obligations are important, but they must be made explicit in the bill and not left to interpretation. With 87% of parents telling us that they find it difficult to afford school uniform and 77% saying that they've had to make financial sacrifices in order to afford them, cutting back on essentials like food, heating or bills, it's imperative that we tackle the cost of uniforms. In one Belfast school, which we costed recently, the uniform kit, including PE for one female pupil, just one of each item and excluding shoes, came to £690.75. It's simply unaffordable for most families. This bill provides a strong starting point, and Parent in Focus welcomes the requirement for the Department to issue statutory guidance. We welcome the inclusion of guidance on unfair costs and the requirement for reporting, and we welcome the focus on consultation, comfort and sustainability. We are concerned that the current language which requires school to have regard to the guidance is too weak. It creates a duty to consider but not a duty to follow. Without stronger expectations, we fear that affordability, flexibility and inclusivity will remain optional for some schools. We're asking the committee to go further and strengthen the bill. While we welcome the intention behind the guidance and the reporting duty, we're concerned that the phrase "from time to time" in relation to reviewing the guidance is too vague. We urge the committee to amend this to require regular time-bound reviews, ideally at least every 3 years, to ensure that guidance stays relevant and effective. These reviews should also incorporate a transparent evaluation of the cost and affordability across all school types. The bill must also mandate a clear cap or maximum threshold on the total cost of uniform. This was one of the strongest messages from parents in our consultation, with 97% supporting the introduction of a cap, echoing the department's own consultation where 88% of respondents also supported this. Parents we spoke with suggested a cap of £50 for primary schools and £120 for post-primary school for branded items. The blazer alone in the school that I referenced earlier cost almost the entire suggested cap at £113 for a blazer. Without a cap, there's no real safeguard against escalating costs or inequity between schools. We support the recommendation made by Save the Children and the Anti-Poverty Expert Advisory Group for the establishment of a task force to help define what affordable actually means for families. The task force must include experts and parents and children and young people themselves, recognising that the lived experience is essential in shaping effective and realistic policy. The bill must also require schools to clearly include PE kits within their published uniform cost and guidance. This is an area where expenses often mount unexpectedly and where requirements can vary drastically between schools. PE kit costs in some cases are approaching the cost of the main uniform and often include multiple branded items. Given that Northern Ireland's school uniform grant is lower than that available in Scotland, Wales and the Republic of Ireland, it's even more important that uniform policies here are realistic and reflect affordability. We would also support a limit on the number of branded or bespoke items required as part of the school uniform. Standard items available from a variety of retailers should be the default unless there's a clear and justified reason for something bespoke. This would allow families to shop around and spread the cost more easily. Finally, the requirement for schools to publish their uniform policy is very welcome, but we believe this must not simply collate what the school has done. It should also include feedback on the consultation with parents and pupils and demonstrate how schools are implementing the guidance, what costs are being incurred by families and whether any adjustments have been made as a result of the consultation or complaints. In closing, this bill represents a valuable opportunity to create a school uniform policy that works for families, respects children's rights and reflects the diversity of our society. Uniform should be a leveller and not a burden. It should promote belonging and not exclusion, and it should support children to participate fully in school life, not limit them. We urge the committee to support the principles of the bill and to consider strengthening its provisions to ensure that guidance is truly enforceable, affordability is clearly defined and inclusivity is embedded in policy and translated into practice. Thank you.
So you covered a whole range of aspects of the bill there. So I'll probably not be able to cover everything, and hopefully other members will get to most of the issues. Just to go to the cost cap first of all, really to follow on from the previous evidence session, from reading your consultation, and please correct me if I'm wrong. My sense was that the feedback seemed that it was from parents was that broadly supportive, but perhaps caveated that needed to be really clear that it was done right, and it didn't create any sort of perverse incentives possibly around schools increasing their costs if the cap goes up. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So 97% of parents that we consulted with did agree with the cap, but there were some concerns about how that would be implemented and what it would look like in practice. So I think parents were, as the concerns that the committee raised, what would this actually look like for parents and how could it be reflected? But I think from a parent and focus perspective, we think the introduction of the cap is really important. So as you can see on the school that we have costed, and that was one of several schools that I costed as part of this process, and we found it very difficult to find any school uniform that would come in at under £120 for even a maximum of 3 branded items. So I think while there is concern that this could be seen as a target rather than a cap, I have found it very difficult to find any school which would be able to actually do that.
I do share that view that I think it would not be the best PR for schools to start raising their prices at a time when a bill's coming forward to try and reduce costs. But on the issue of the cap, then, I mean, some of the concerns that we're trying to navigate as a committee in relation to that would be around the timelines we have here. Minister's very, very keen to get this delivered really immediately after summer recess, and there doesn't appear to have been any groundwork prepared around what a cap would look like. So I think there is some nervousness around directing something in a bill that there is zero preparatory work for, and that perhaps the Minister and Department aren't bought into. That would certainly be my concern. In terms of Parenting Focus's position on this, the Department has been very clear they do want to consult on this and will be doing so very soon. Is that something you would welcome, a really broad and meaningful consultation on the cap to give the opportunity for stakeholders, including parents, obviously, to really clarify what they would like to see delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was clear through our responses from parents that there seemed to be a lot of ambiguity. They didn't really understand what a cap would look like. So I think consultation with the department would be really helpful for parents, and some information around the options that would be available around that would be really helpful as well. But as we see, 97% of parents were in agreement with the cap as a general principle. So I think we could probably foresee how parents will react to that.
Be clear in terms of the feeling on
absolutely,
it.
that meaningful consultation with the department would be really important.
Just on the similar issue then of, again, it's an enabling power, but around that limit on branded items, was it similar levels of support from parents in terms of their engagement with that aspect of the consultation?
Yeah, so absolutely, right across the board in both our focus groups and in our online survey, parents have told us that a brand on capped items actually, it seemed to be the preferable options, because I think parents understood more how that would be reflected in practice, but they would be very keen to do that. And I suppose I had suggested maybe the three capped items in line with the policy in Westminster, and parents were very keen that would happen. Parents have told us, on repeated occasions, that the number of branded items, especially for PE kits, is it just means that children cannot participate. It's really prohibitive for them to participate in sport, and for parents who are especially trying to encourage their teenage girls, this is a major factor for them.
Okay, and again, on the branded items, you've used that number 3. We've obviously got that in England, which is under consideration at the moment. In your view, if we landed on a figure of 3 branded items, would your assessment be that is likely to have a positive impact then in terms of that particular issue around PE? That would be the driver for that?
Absolutely. So whenever I was costing the items as part of this, I think most schools required about 8 branded items between their PE kit and their school uniform. Yeah. So it will have a dramatic impact if that's reduced down to 3 on the cost for families.
That's really helpful. Couple of really quick ones. So again, as quickly as you can deal with these, I'm just going to put it out there. It's a particular hobby horse of mine. I was really, really pleased to hear you mention early years. I think it's all of the conversations around this seem to be focused around post-primary. I think primary is absolutely vital, and in the early years and foundation stage that we're ensuring uniform policies really give kids the best opportunity to access that play-based curriculum. And I was really welcome to hear that, so I'm just going to note that, and I think we are hoping to hear from the Bill's office around maybe a potential amendment to build that into the bill, so if that's maybe some feedback you can bring back to parents. Obviously that would be subject to committee agreement, but we're certainly looking at it. The only other thing I wanted to raise was just moving away from cost very briefly, was just around the notion of inclusivity. You mentioned that at the start of your evidence. We are again waiting for a potential draft text on an amendment for consideration around an inclusivity clause. There have been different views expressed in committee as to whether that's helpful or not. That would be looking at something around requiring uniform policies to make provision for gender neutrality, for needs arising from disability, race, religion, cultural observance, those sorts of issues. Is that something that, from a parenting focused perspective, you would be supportive of?
Absolutely. So aside from the cost, that was one of the main concerns for parents, was the gender neutrality was one of the main things that came up. Parents across the board were telling us they felt that their daughters should be allowed to wear trousers if that's what they wanted to do in school. They liked having the option, but they felt it was very unfair. I think one of the terms was, in this day and age, why would they have to wear a skirt? So absolutely, that's something we'd be really supportive of. Again, special educational needs was a huge concern, with many parents telling us that their children face disciplinary measures around maybe not wearing appropriate shoes, or wearing their jumper in school, or having a top buttoned on. And we understand that that's difficult for the school to manage. And most schools, I have to say, a lot of parents also had really good experiences with schools as well, where schools were quite reactive and were able to put things in place to ensure that the child felt comfortable. But many parents did say when their children's they're uncomfortable, it's not conducive to them achieving their best in school as well. So absolutely, that's something we'd be really supportive of.
That's great. Look, I'll probably leave it at that. I mean, other than just to say it was very clear message from young people around those issues, those specific issues that came through very clearly, and then we're going to hear from Menstruation Matters in the next evidence session, which again will draw out some of those issues, particularly affecting on the gender aspect of things. No, that's been really helpful. I'll open up to members. I've had an indication from Michelle, Kathy. Anyone else want to come in? David? Michelle? Yeah, Danny? Yeah. Michelle, if you want to go ahead, yeah.
Emma, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to, you've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to ask about the definition of a school uniform. You referenced that in your briefing. Could you just explain why you feel that's so important to have that specifically defined?
Again, that was another main concern that parents came back to us with, that this ambiguity in schools around what constitutes a school uniform. So in relation to shoes, that was one of our main concerns. Other things such as piercings and makeup. So we actually heard where a child was subject to disciplinary measures. They weren't allowed their breakfast because they'd been wearing makeup to school. So you know that this is the extent that some schools are going to. The parents were then looking at the school uniform policy and saying, actually there's nothing really in here where we could see our child it's breaking. So I think just to have that transparency in every school uniform policy, so that parents and children themselves understand really what the policy is in the school, and that there's no kind of wiggle room there.
Yeah. Last thing, quickly. Last week we heard from the Head Teachers Association, who seemed to think there was no need for any legislation or statutory guidance on this. The evidence you've given so far and from your briefing would contradict that. Could you just say a bit more about parents' feelings on this issue?
Absolutely. Well, as part of this consultation process, we spoke to 600 parents. In the last 5 months, I have spoken to about 2,000 parents, and I have to say in every focus group I've had, parents have brought up the issue of the cost of access in education, and especially school uniform. And I do believe that some schools are doing it really well, but I think there is a disconnect between some principals and the families that their schools are servicing, and that disconnect around the affordability and what is affordable to the families. And I have absolutely seen across the board that this is a real concern for parents, and parents are struggling. We also do a big parenting survey biannually, and every year in that big parenting survey we have consistent concerns around the cost of uniforms as well, and the cost of access in education in general. But I would absolutely say there is the need for primary legislation, and is for those schools who are the outliers, who are not doing this as well as some others.
Michelle. Kathy, you were next.
Thanks, Chair. Emma, thanks a million for coming in and for all the work that Parent Focus do around all of this and many other issues. I wanted to ask you around, we heard from witnesses yesterday, and there was one lady in particular who was a parent who used the school uniform swaps. And how valuable they were for her. If she didn't have them, basically she wouldn't have been able to send her children to school. One thing she did raise though is and she certainly didn't feel any embarrassment or stigma as to using it, but she did acknowledge that there probably was. I knew of other parents who maybe didn't, go at certain times and to try and avoid. And I know it's something that's within the bill, but do you feel that it's strong enough within the bill? Is something that you're picking up from parents to actually be able to use them first off, and then do you feel that the bill addresses that?
I don't think it addresses it in the way it should in the bill at the minute, and it's absolutely something we hear from parents again. There is still that stigma attached to it, and parents, schools, I have to say, are very good at finding creative ways to encourage parents to use it. So should it be open at certain times? I've heard of occasions where schools directly message parents to let them know they can come in at a certain time to try and remove that stigma. But I think what we would encourage is that relationship between the community and schools as well, and really that parental participation within schools, so that when it's an inclusive culture within the schools, parents would be much more likely to do that. And I think actually some of that was included within the bill, or maybe within the guidelines. It would be really helpful. Looking at that culture within the school. We have heard on numerous occasions of asylum-seeking families or newcomer families where they really are heavily reliant on the school banks because they may have moved several times within the year. And it would just be simply unaffordable for them to send their children to school otherwise. And I think schools have been really good at coming up with creative ways to encourage this. But if there was something about that, maybe more so in the guidelines, I think it would be really helpful.
Right, that's really useful, actually, even that community link as well. You mentioned there, and to pick up on the Chair's point around the play-based, the early years and the comfort. Is it something that you pick up on as well as to that, growing to post-primary then as well? It's just something that I've picked up in talking to different young people around you know, well, it mightn't necessarily be play-based when it comes to post-primary. They're still taking part in the likes of technology and science and things like that. And the real, just not being comfortable in the collar or in the skirt or whatever it might be. Is that something you're picking up on? And, you know, we heard yesterday from the deputy chair around a school that had completely changed their uniform to being trousers or leggings for girls, whichever they prefer. Trousers for boys, and just the half zip, the branded half zip, rather than the blazer and the collared shirt and things like that. What would be your view on that?
I think it's something the Commissioner picked up on yesterday was the functionality of uniform, and that's something we'd be really supportive of. I think there was a real distinct difference actually, and now this is only based on our own consultation, but with rural primary schools who seem to actually have much more functional uniforms. So they were girls or boys in leggings or tracksuit bottoms, a polo shirt and a jumper, which meant that they were able to access their curriculum in all those ways. And then there's that real distinct change going to post-primary where they're often a much more restrictive uniform. And it's something that parents pick up on as well. I know as someone from a rural area, I was walking home miles from school wearing high shoes, which just were not practical whatsoever. And I do think that's something we hear from parents, that a lot of the time their children aren't going to things after school as well because of the functionality of their uniform. So I think absolutely it was actually a suggestion that came up many times from parents as well. Why can we not just have trousers on the half zip? And actually a lot of times now parents are reporting that their schools are encouraging the children to come in wearing their PE kit because they're doing something and that would be much more practical. So parents are saying, you know, if they can do this on certain days, why can this not be the norm?
Okay, that's great. That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. David, you're next.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your evidence so far. I just picked up again in your written submission there that one of the things that you thought should be taken into account is ethical purchasing. There's obviously there's an obvious tension between ethical products and cost, and I'm just wondering to what extent do you think a cap should, if the cap is decided upon, but how should that take into account ethical products?
I think if the cap is limiting the amount of branded products, it would be much easier to do that as well. And I suppose that is not our area of expertise, but you know, the sustainability.
Well, it is. I mean, it's just in terms. It's in there in your written evidence, and I'm just sort of. So, I don't think it's not as black and white as you can have ethical or low cost, or but you can't have both. I mean, there is probably a medium somewhere there. But I guess in all of these things, we're asking for legislation. In particular, you're pushing very hard on the cap element and so on. So we're being asked to draw quite hard lines on these things. And if you know ethical products is something that you're wanting us to consider, you want the minister to consider, you know, we need to know what exactly that looks like, and that can add significantly to cost. So if you're a school and you're looking to meet a cap, it would be, you know, you could be looking down and you will be looking to meet your cap by saying these items unbranded can be sourced at, you know, this, you know, on Amazon, on Tesco, wherever, at the lowest possible price. Now, some of those, I do think that being ethical is a corporate responsibility rather than that of a consumer. I don't think it's reasonable to ask people to go around thinking about where exactly their t-shirts are being made. But nevertheless, schools, if they're trying to come to a low cost, will not be necessarily, they'll be trying to meet under that target so they can say we're compliant. So how do you think a cap should take that into account? Do you think that a cap should only be made up of you know, a survey of items deemed to be ethical?
I think that the cap should just be reflective of the branded items, and if we're doing that, it would be much more easy then to have ethically produced products that are capped at that price, so that we can, like, you know, if it's a plain pair of black trousers, a plain top, that would be much easier. And we're not saying that should be there should be any restrictions around that, but I think if we are capping the branded items at a certain cost, it should be easier then for schools to be able to find that and then ethically.
I think there's ways in which those items can be sourced, but we'll move on from that. I think the flexibility in materials and designs. Again, I'm going to ask you. I'm not trying to be pedantic, but where do you suggest, if you were a principal trying to come to a decision, where would be the lines that you would draw around the scope of what that flexibility should look like? Because I'm just thinking the whole idea of a uniform is to bring, well, there's a number of principles to a uniform, and some of them you've outlined, but a degree of uniformity across pupils. You also, in my opinion, and you know, you talk about haircuts and different things, and you might disagree with this, but there's a degree of, you want almost fashion and fashion trends and so on to be absent from that. You don't want to. So what? How do you encourage that uniformity across the school? But with what kind of flexibility in terms of design and materials are you? I understand in terms of the inclusivity piece, people with, you know, special needs or other considerations. I think there will always be exceptions, whatever rules we draw, and I think that should be taken into account, absolutely, and we talked about that yesterday. But how do you, what kind of scope are you talking about flexibility?
I think we were talking about that in relation to inclusivity, in relation to children with special education
needs. It is about exceptions
needs.
rather than
so
across
yes,
the board.
Absolutely.
This isn't about saying, you know, anyone can choose something as long as the right colour or...
No,
okay.
Not that in that way at all. No, when there are children who have special education needs or some form of disability that means that they cannot wear, or it would be uncomfortable for them to wear, we would like to see that exclusively in the policy rather than it having to be an ask for families, which we have heard. You know, we have heard of children with ASD who are maybe having to fight to wear a different kind of trousers or material and things like that. So that's kind of what we would like to see that explicitly outlined in the policy rather than as the norm.
My last question then would be around, I guess, and it's not to take away, I'm sure the parents who've spoken to you and you know have considered this at length, but quite often what question you're asked will shape the response that you're given, and that's why we were hearing a lot about a cap. If you go out and talk to people in the street, they will talk about this school uniforms bill as a cap on school uniforms. And I'm just conscious, I get the feeling personally that parents understandably, and we're with them, I think most of our parties have something in our manifestos around lowering the cost of school uniforms, so that it's an objective for us all. I would just say, do you think that parents are more focused on the outcome than the mechanism? And actually what they hear when we're talking about a cap is that's a guarantee to them of a lower cost, but actually what they really want is not, you know, schools not to be ripping the backside out of it when it comes to the cost of uniforms.
Yeah, I think parents' main concern is that they're struggling so much with the cost of access in education, so that is why they're highlighting the cap, because they see this as the means to an end and they're not maybe looking at the bill as a whole. But I think absolutely that is the main concern for parents. I think we do need to consult with parents in a meaningful way, and we have heard, you know, examples of where schools have told us they have consulted with parents, but actually when we look at the consultation process, it's not a meaningful consultation whatsoever. So I would really like to see the guidelines from the department having a proper meaningful consultation with parents and ensuring that what parents are telling them are actually followed through. So we would promote the use of the Lundy model of participation, where we're providing parents with a space, a voice, the audience, but also the influence. So we've heard many occasions, and I've actually, in the process of doing this consultation, was told by a principal there's no point of asking them because they don't know what they want. So he did a consultation with the parents in his school, but then that was his answer. So, you know, it was never going to be a meaningful consultation process. So I would really like to see that included in the guidelines. And I do think you're absolutely right. Parents and people in general are sometimes led by the questions, but I think that's why it's so important for the guidelines to have proper meaningful consultation included within.
No, listen, I accept that. I think it's perfectly possible that parents would, in a certain school, might have different views on things and make it difficult to sort of bring together one view. But I also think, even as a traditionalist in many areas, I think there are schools that need to reflect on where they've got to with this and whether their approach is suitable and in the best interest of the families that they serve. So I agree with that as well. But thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, David. Just really briefly, I'm just going to about to bring Danny in. I mean, one of the things I think we've discussed in the bill that was I think surprised possibly everybody that there it wasn't mandated that parents would be consulted with, nor was it mandated young people. Just briefly, I'm assuming from your organisation's perspective, that's something you'd like to see. We have looked at potentially an amendment that the committee could bring forward on that.
Yes, of course. Well, this bill will directly impact parents and their children and young people, and we know this is a huge concern for parents, and we absolutely think parents need to be consulted with. And I have to say, some schools are very good at consulting with parents, but it's making sure that consultation process is meaningful. So we would absolutely like to see that.
It seemed an odd omission, and I'm not sure what the objection to it would have been. But there you go, Danny.
Thank you, Chair. Emma, thanks very much. You've covered so much, and I would agree with very much everything you've said so far. £690 was one, with £113 just alone for the blazer. So, see, a part of that 690, I'm guessing that if you don't have all of that, you can't participate in everything in that school.
So within that, I included one blazer, one jumper. So every day wear. It also included a summer blouse, which was required in the third term for the school, and I also included 2 different pieces of PE kit, which were required for different things, from what I could gauge. So my understanding is, yes, this is all required for that child to participate in activities within the school. There, I should mention, there were other options available on top of this £690, which I didn't include as well.
Yeah, but you basically, that was the standard rate for that school.
Yeah.
So I suppose my question, and you would engage with more parents than I would, is that deliberate from the school to exclude certain backgrounds?
I suppose I can't answer that, but I would say it would probably be a prohibitive factor for some parents when they're choosing which school to send their child to. We have heard from parents who tell us they don't want to encourage their child to aim for certain schools because they know that the cost is just not going to work for their families. We haven't even reached the end of the school year, and we've already had calls from parents who are telling us they're concerned about the cost of PE kit. They have just paid for a full school uniform. One parent had told us how her child had bought a jumper, but she wasn't sure if everyone else wore a cardigan, and she says, sure, I'll just buy it, or you can just buy me it in September. And the mum's already panicking, how am I going to afford to buy another piece of uniform on top of this?
In your view, if it was then the 3, you said the 3 brand that included, like, even doing that alone prevents them from doing that.
Absolutely.
And that's only just one measure within it, because it would only be, I suppose, one piece of a puzzle if you were to do it. It is really worrying when we have it like that. And the good thing about the presentations we've had so far, particularly last night and yourself, is that this convinces me more than ever that we haven't seen the guidance, but I actually want to see a lot more in the primary legislation now, because it's very clear, because it stops that abuse.
Yeah,
and I know not all schools do it, and I know that there's a massive support out there for uniforms, but what is a uniform? That should be the question, because do we really need blazers anymore? Like, that's £113, and but I would say across the board blazers are the most expensive of all the items. Why can't there be a step up? You're still wearing your school, you're still proud of your school, but you're comfortable. Yeah. So just for, I think, is there anything else you just wanted to highlight? Because I think you've covered everything for me anyway.
Yes, no, I think.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Peter, you indicated.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Emma, for your evidence this afternoon. Emma, you used the phrase and in your oral evidence, and I think you sort of mainly explained to my colleague David, but I wrote it down: inclusion but not conformity. Can you just take a minute and explain what that means?
Well, I suppose there seem to be a lot of issues with children around what the uniform looks like, and how that is kind of how the schools are really implementing the uniform policy. And I think if we had clarity around that, so we're saying there should be a slight room for self-expression. So an example that I have given to parents is maybe earrings, not hoop earrings but stud earrings, so that there should be some room for children to have self-expression within the school, but with still having an understanding of where they are, and that they're representing the school as well. And I think if there's clarity in the policies around that. We have heard from a lot of parents actually who have said their child has maybe been sent home from school because they have dyed hair, but the teacher has dyed hair, and parents are struggling to understand what impact this has on their child's learning. And I have to say, parents in the majority are not trying to send their children to school with green hair or, you know, something that's really outrageous. This is maybe blonde highlights in a 16-year-old girl's hair, and they're saying, you know, what impact does this have on my child's learning? So I think there should be a degree of flexibility within the policy, especially as we reach kind of that post-16 age as well. But yeah, that was kind of our
Well, that's fine. And
interpretation.
look, I agree. And I'm just a bit frustrated in that the guidance is there. What we're talking about in committee is that primary legislation that puts a guidance on a legal footing. The guidance is there, and as we have reflected in committee on several occasions before this, schools should already be doing this. It's all there, and lots of schools are doing it. And it's the schools that, some schools that aren't, are really forcing this into legislation, which should not be necessary. And my view is, and I think it was reflected in some of the questioning that you had with Danny, I mean, the sole purpose of this for me is to ensure that no child has to make a decision about what school they go to based on how much the uniform. That should not be in any way any factor that a parent or a child should consider in terms of where they go to next. And that's what we have to do in this bill now. Other committee members might have other ideas about what the bill looks like and what it's going to end up with, but that's my raison d'etre for what we want to try and achieve on this.
No, I would absolutely agree, and I do think most schools do adhere to the guidance as is, but not all schools do. Yeah, not all schools do, and that is the issue. And I think we have heard lots of regulations of really punitive measures in relation to school uniform policy, you know, where girls often feel humiliated. I gave the example earlier of a child who was told she wasn't allowed to participate in breakfast club, and then she was a child who was receiving preschool meals, and she was denied access to breakfast club because she was wearing makeup to school. And I think there are a lot of concerns from parents around issues like that you know, it's maybe not proportionate to the crime.
No, look, I agree, and I think we had this debate with the Children's Commissioner. I certainly did yesterday, but you know, what happens when a child doesn't do the right thing or you know, doesn't appear, and what that how that should be dealt with. And you know, in that example that you just gave, you just sort of said, well, actually, you know, here are the, whatever the rules are, here are the rules. But I mean, denying a child breakfast. Don't start me. I have one more question for you. So yesterday we were talking about the Claire Sugden amendment, and I've written down here, Claire doesn't mind me paraphrasing it here, trousers for all and shorts instead of skirts. Now, I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of all that, because in the research I've done so far, certainly a lot of teenage girls I spoke to, they want to wear leggings instead of shorts or skirts. I'm not sure whether leggings is going to go into primary legislation, but leaving aside whatever that piece of that amendment looks like, you've given in your evidence that you feel that girls should be allowed to wear trousers in school. Do you believe that boys should be allowed to wear skirts in school?
I think it should be a gender neutral policy, and if that was what a boy decided to do, then I don't think there should be an issue with that in school. I said gender neutral in both practicality and in language. It's not something that we often have coming up at Parent Focus, to be honest, but we would advocate that the policy is gender neutral for all. I think the main concern in this, though, is that girls are not allowed to wear trousers to school. I think that's, you know, that it's...
But if it's written in primary legislation, and certainly I'd be interested to know whether, you know, you would have consulted on your parents on this. If this goes into primary legislation, you'd be looking at, you know, schools where boys, for a joke, just maybe a whole class would just dress up in skirts for the day, or you would see a whole range of things. I mean, this would be in primary legislation. They'd be entitled to do that. I'm wondering whether or not you would foresee any problems in terms of maintenance of good order and discipline in a school if that was the case.
Well, I think the example you gave there, if it was done as a joke by the entire class, there's not maintenance and good order there anyway. So I would say the overall issue, we've heard a lot of evidence on the upskirt and other issues
I accept that.
And we would absolutely advocate for a gender neutral policy. I don't see that would cause any issues. And we are hoping to move towards a more inclusive society. And if that is what a boy chose to wear to school, hopefully there would be no issue with that.
Thank you, Peter. And I think Colin is still having issues with audio, so I'll bring Cara in as the last indication I have.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for being here. Firstly, you did a fantastic job engaging with MLAs ahead of RSE debates and in committee as well. So it's great that you're here today, and having over 594 responses to your survey, I think reflects how important it is to have you here today to communicate parents' needs and concerns. I'm just going to go back a bit to the self-expression topic. We had the luxury of having our young people with us yesterday, and I got the chance to ask them some questions, and they felt it was important that self-expression should be given to children when it comes to uniform and appearance. And you touched on there, the example of being denied breakfast, which is just utterly disgraceful, and it kind of does concern me that each school has a different approach with this kind of policy. So my question is just around balancing the rights of self-expression. So we know that Article 13 of the Rights of the Child, UN Rights of the Child, allows children to have self-expression. As a committee, if we're shaping this bill, what way do you think we can balance, you've already sort of spoke to it, I suppose, but what way do you think we can balance the rights of self-expression in our young people and also keeping them appropriate for school? What way do you think we can do that by allowing, I suppose, an element of flexibility so children can be themselves but also be dressed appropriately?
Well, I think there are many good examples. I suppose the Assembly itself has not a uniform policy, but a dress code. So there are many examples like that in work attire of how people can look smart but still can have the ability to have self-expression. So I think if we look at those examples of good practice and how that is implemented in workplaces and in other areas, the same kind of policy should then continue on to our schools. I think especially as children get older, we have heard it much more maybe in that post-16 age group where they're maybe going to work after school and girls are saying they want to wear light makeup, they maybe want to have highlights in their hair, and this is causing issues with their school, and their parents are really concerned that this is not affecting their education, but it's adversely affecting their education through the punishment, through the school policy. So I think there are other good practice we can look at and see how that can be reflected into school uniform policy, that there does give that room for self-expression but within school parameters.
And absolutely, my argument would be, if the parent is okay with this and it's acceptable in the school setting, it's not really an issue. And in the young people that I've spoken with and the parents that I've spoken with, they say this is in many ways very heavily a gendered issue because it seems to be girls time and time again that are being pulled out of the classroom, told to remove makeup. There's an element of shame around this. And when I speak to young people, that's what's coming through very strongly. But no, that's pretty much everything from me. I suppose just my final question is, in your discussions with parents, have you ever become aware of a student being suspended for either too long a beard, long hair, or makeup use?
No, I don't think we have come across this. We have come across continuous disciplinary measures where maybe that was threatened, but I don't think we have ever come across a case where it has actually led to that with parents. But parents are concerned. I've heard numerous cases of parents getting phone calls about their child having a beard or their child's hair being too long, and actually especially for boys in that case. And the parents are saying, they have no issue with what way their child has their hair, and the parents really are concerned that the school is kind of infringing on the child's rights at that point as well, whenever the parents have no issue with it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. I think we want our kids to be confident and comfortable in an affordable uniform that doesn't burden parents. So, no, thank you so much for coming to committee and for really articulating where parents are at and where our young people are at. It's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. So Cathy, you'd asked just to come in briefly.
Just really briefly, Sharon, I hope you don't mind me. It's something that's slightly aside from this, but it's still related, and it's just around your survey and things like that. I know that where this flagged to me was around the Irish League of Credit Unions, and the cost of school uniforms was frightening for some parents, and parents borrowing money basically to pay for it. But voluntary contributions was another one. that was high up there. Is that something that you are finding? Is that something feedback's coming from you, parents under pressure?
Absolutely. So as I say, we have consulted with about 2,000 parents in recent months about their parent participation in their children's education and the cost of access and education, including voluntary contributions, and actually even the technology that the schools are requiring their children to have. So we've heard of grammar schools who have extortionate costs of uniform and then requiring a laptop in the first week of term. So parents have just, came through, finally managed to send their child there, and then they have this another huge burden on them. So absolutely, voluntary contributions is another one that we have huge concerns from parents that these are in fact not voluntary contributions, and it's very much highlighted when their child hasn't put this forward. So that is another huge concern for parents, is the cost of access and education as a whole.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. It's something we've asked as a committee as well, and there doesn't seem to be, nobody in the department really seemed to know what the policy was or where it was. So that's really good to know. Thanks very much.
Yes, won't we follow up to that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think as we have witnesses here to speak to the bill, we may as well hear evidence from them.
Thank you. That's a really good point about the cost of the education. You bring in voluntary contributions and they're not voluntary. Just to ask, is there like some asking for £50 and maybe some asking for £500? Are you seeing that even within it? Because I want to go labouring back to that school of the 690, but I suspect that they would be very guilty of theirs being the highest you could ask for.
Well, with this particular school, I'm unaware of what the costs are, but we, through this consultation, parents were quoting things from, I'd say, about £120 up to about £800 for voluntary contributions to their school. Yeah. And some were asking actually for a voluntary contribution on each term as well, and putting in place different mechanisms as well that parents can pay. So I suppose it's encouragement towards a voluntary contribution.
And I suppose then what would be like the pressure? Like what is there any like lived experiences of like if someone doesn't pay, what like are they avoiding going to the school, or are they getting emails or text
we had
messages?
parents who have told us about the school ringing them to say they hadn't set up their direct debit for their voluntary contribution, and avoiding phone calls from the school, unsure whether they should answer if it's about their child or if it's about the voluntary contributions.
Thank you.
The additional issue of the voluntary grammars are permitted in law to charge for the capital costs as well. So it is there's a contribution for that as well from parents. So these things can ramp up, and I think possibly after we get through the scrutiny of this bill, it maybe be worth probing some of that with the department again. But I don't see any other indications. So thank you for your time, and that's been again a really. David, you just want to
just the point, I think, because I think I can understand some of the minute you said about studs. I think we can agree with that. I think part of the problem, it's less question, no comment. I think part of the problem for some schools is going to be if you start, having no makeup, for instance, is a very clear line. Yeah. Being allowed minimal makeup, or I mean, I'm not an expert in makeup, so I defer to your expertise in this. But for schools trying to manage, I'm just mindful that for schools trying to manage a situation like that, when you make it a grey area, you then can lead to more tension between schools and parents when you start saying, well, actually, this teacher's decided that's just on the wrong side of the line.
I think the important aspect of that is the consultation with parents, so that parents understand, the parents and teachers and the school are in agreement with what is deemed acceptable within the school, and if that consultation is done correctly, then that should be fine.
I certainly would agree that there's a difference between, saying to someone when they come one day, actually, if you couldn't do that, going on and ongoing.
Bring comment to a close, I think, on this.
Cheers, thanks, Chair.
Just probably if we start down a rabbit hole, we could be here all afternoon. So look, thank you for your time, and look, a really thorough run through the issues on the bill. So thank you, Emma. And we'll no doubt have issues arising from that when we have a conversation at the end of the session. So that brings us on to item 8 on the agenda. I'll just check at this juncture if anybody is looking for a comfort break. Happy to give it 5 minutes. Okay, if we could just turn off the live feed just to facilitate that, please.
Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
Okay, so that moves us on to item 8 on our agenda, which is our final oral briefing today, and again on the School Uniforms Guidelines and Allowances Bill, and this is an oral briefing from the charity Menstruation Matters. I believe the witness is joining online, so are they available to join? Hopefully should be coming on in a moment. So I'd refer members to the clerk's cover note at page 39, and then the briefing paper from Menstruation Matters at page 41 of your packs. So purpose, as with the previous briefing, is to receive perspectives on the bill that's before us, and specifically in this instance to help understand the perspective of pupils managing periods at school or who may potentially miss school because of difficulties affording appropriate clothing. So joining us today we have Katrina McDonnell. So you're very welcome and thank you for your time today. Katrina is a volunteer with Menstruation Matters and Homeless Period Belfast, and she is going to be bringing the perspectives of Menstruation Matters to committee today on the bill. Members may recall that the Period Products Free Provision Act was coordinated by this committee in the last mandate, so some of the provisions in that bill may be relevant to the conversation, or in that act, sorry, forgive me, should be relevant to this conversation today. So really, Katrina, other than a welcome, and if you want to add anything to the introduction just to clarify your role in either of those organisations, please feel free to do so. But I'll be handing over to you for any opening remarks or presentation you want to make of up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move to question and answer. We have your written briefing as well, which did cover the issues comprehensively, so thank you for submitting that. But over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm Katrina, founder of Menstruation Matters. It's great to be back. Last time I was in one of these meetings was when we were trying to get policy change for free period products in schools, and that we did. So yeah, thanks so much. But basically, I'm just really here to talk about obviously our work in tackling period poverty and advocating for period equality, which includes distributing period products, but also we deliver events and workshops primarily in schools to break the stigma around menstruation. And last year I delivered workshops in schools that reached around 2,000 girls. And while our focus is on periods, students consistently raise related issues. So like where period products are placed, whether they're allowed to access the toilet during class, which is a big one that comes up, but also, and more relevant for this discussion today, is how uncomfortable school uniforms can be when menstruating. And from that, I just wanted to provide some insights into what has been fed back to me during these very meaningful workshops, but also what our supporters have kind of said through kind of polls that we've done. And a big one that always comes up, I've kind of said this already, is uniform discomfort. So, for example, tight waistbands on skirts often exacerbate the cramps. And some students say they've actually felt a bit sick from the pain and discomfort. Obviously, as well, a lack of choice. You know, many pupils want to be able to wear trousers, and I know that has come up in many of the discussions that you've had over the last 2 weeks. And some have even mentioned how they actually feared having to wear a skirt or leaking or feeling uncomfortable during GCSE examinations and A-levels exams. And of course, you know, none of us would want that. And actually 98% of our supporters, and I do want to, you know, as a disclaimer, very aware that a lot of our supporters are, of course, an echo chamber and, of course, as well, very period positive. But I still think it provides a bit of an insight that 98% of them agree that there should be an option for trousers available, or at least young people are able to wear kind of extra layers as they please. Attendance impact has come up quite a lot. So students have reported missing school or going home early due to the discomfort of their uniform. Fear of leaking always being kind of the main issue while wearing skirts. Engagement is also a thing with young people, anxiety about uniforms and periods directly affecting their focus and participation in class. And then what I find quite interesting is when we talk about and end up in a debate with young people about uniform, and also from our supporters when we polled them, the majority said that actually comfort, choice and affordability matter much more than school identity and formality. PE kit always comes up. I know you discussed that at length, and that does come up in the bill as well. But what I find interesting from speaking to parents is the financial strain comes up as well. So 85% felt that students who menstruate are disproportionately impacted by uniform related costs from, for example, and you saw this in my briefing paper, soiling tights, for example, from leaking and always having to kind of change over uniform due to that. And then just lastly, as an insight, 98% of our supporters believe all schools should have a period aware and considerate uniform policy. So our recommendation is that all school uniform policies explicitly consider menstrual health and dignity of students. So this includes offering options of dark coloured or loose fitting clothing during menstruation, or ensuring affordability of these items, especially for those who menstruate. So as the bill kind of rightly seeks to address cost, it must also protect the comfort and dignity of those who menstruate, which is a large proportion of the student population. And it's really important as well for me and for others that I've spoken to be mindful that uniform policies that fail to acknowledge this reality will actually continue to contribute to shame, distraction and exclusion. So we obviously urge the Department of Education Committee to embed an affordable period aware uniform policy, so that it's a crucial step in ensuring that no student's education is limited by what they're wearing during their period.
Thank you, Katrina. And look, as I said at the outset, your written briefing was really comprehensive, and I think covered a lot of the real specifics here in terms of where some of the issues arise in this area. Just on that, really, I really just have one question on this, because your recommendation is very clear. You're advocating that you would like to see the legislation mandating uniform policies as being, the phrase you use is period aware. Do you have anything specific that you think would need to be included in the bill specifically to I suppose, expand on what being period aware means, or do you think that phrase would create a substantial enough duty to deliver the kind of uniform policies that you're looking to see that take proper account of the impact of menstruation on how pupils feel about their school uniforms?
I think we should actually be quite more specific. And, in clause 2, when it talks about affordability and comfortability, that is something that suggests that it's, one size fits all, and it's not. So I think failing to actually explicitly consider people who menstruate or pupils who menstruate in that clause risks kind of excluding a significant group whose uniform kind of related challenges are uniquely different and pressing. So I think specifics would be key, and of course specifics around periods and about being able to wear trousers, I think will really help destigmatise periods, and actually it complements the current policy as well with free provision of period products. So period aware and period considerate, of course, in there, but I think specifics would be needed just so that it's not open or up to the discretion of each school, and that it's more clear and less broad. Does that answer your question?
No, I think it does. Maybe just to clarify, so it's just to check in terms of what's in the bill. You would want to see some more specific language, or is it at the guidelines that you would want to maybe start to expand on some of the, particularly really drawing out what you've put in your written briefing?
Well, the thing is with guidelines, it just makes it a bit broad, doesn't it? And schools can end up just doing what they want. So, because we feel strongly about this and we want it to be something that is enforced, we would like to see it in the clause. But of course, as well, if it's within the guidelines, then that's great too.
That's great. That's really helpful. And this is something on a range of issues we've been working through as a committee, how prescriptive that this legislation should be and how much of it should sit with guidelines. So it's always a balance. But I just wanted to personally put on record my thanks for bringing this specific issue to committee, because I think it's really important that we have these conversations, and that we're ensuring that that we are period aware in terms of any policy decisions that are being made in school. And I think all schools need to be shifting their thinking on a range of issues. And I did note you mentioned toilet access. That's something that when you speak to students, they raise all the time about some of the policies around toilet access can cause real issues. So I think it's probably good just to perhaps even think in the future about hearing some more evidence around some of the wider issues impacting pupils in schools on this specific issue. But that's everything from me at this stage. So I've had an indication from David. Any other members want to come in? Kathy?
Thanks very much, Chair.
Go ahead, David. And Karen,
and thanks for your evidence so far. I guess what I was wanting to sort of explore a bit was the sort of, again from your written submissions so on, that some would like the option of PE clothes, for instance, whenever they're menstruating for comfort. I would imagine. I guess, how do you? I think it's a good thing that we've seen in sports some of this being taken into account and so on, that makes it easier for women engaging in sport. And I think where we can, there should be consideration in this field too. But I do worry that how do you, if you have a rule that allows for the wearing of PE clothes for people who are menstruating, then how do you place that so you don't end up with a situation where people who just want to wear PE clothes for comfort all the time are not just wearing them for comfort all of the time, if you understand, because that would be one rule for one rule for another. I understand there'll be some, and there might be some around the table who say, well, why shouldn't they be able to wear like PE clothes all the time? I'm not of that view, I'll be honest. I'm not likely to be of that view. So in the current context, I guess, is what I'm asking you to speak to.
Yeah, I think that's a fair concern, and it's definitely something that has been brought up. Always open up a debate in these workshops to kind of empower young people to debate against each other on these issues. And there is some people who's for that and who's against it. I think for us, if we just actually allowed students to wear trousers as well as skirts, then we wouldn't need to rely on PE uniform. I think that's a kind of temporary thing at the minute, because trousers aren't an option. So if actually we bring in trousers as an option, then we can avoid students having to kind of always want to wear PE gear.
Okay.
So that's kind of what my response would be to that. Let's actually bring in trousers so we don't have that issue, where students might end up taking advantage of it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that answer. And again, I understand the example, for instance, that you give. So I'm not challenging it, but people tying a jumper around their waist or something. That's not something that I would have ever imagined was being done for that purpose. But extra layers as they please was something you said during your evidence there. How again, I think, do you not think that poses a similar challenge, whereby it depends what the layers are, and I think there should be some allowance, and I'm not trying to shut that down, but I think if pupils are told there's a bit of a free for all for that, they will naturally, I think, use it to sort of challenge boundaries. And how do you think that sits and you manage that challenge?
Again, fair point about the risks of that. I think it would probably give a similar response to, if we have trousers, we don't need an extra layer around a skirt. But also come back to just our stance, in that we agree with the 98% of our respondents and supporters that believe comfortability comes before formality, and kind of school identity at that point. Comfort should be the kind of priority for young people, so that they can go on about their school day without having to worry about the discomfort of their period, or the worry of this leaking. I can't labour that point enough, this worry of leaking, and actually the experience of young people leaking is at the fore all the time. So students are wanting to cover up their skirts to add that extra layer, and if we just had those trousers or a bit more flexibility, I think we would avoid all of that kind of thing that you're talking about.
Well, look, I've no problem saying that comfort should be a consideration, of course, and certainly I think that the needs of young women in this regard should be considered as well. But thank you for your answers. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Kathy, you were next.
Thanks, Chair. Katrina, thanks so much. Not just for this presentation, but for, you've went over some of the work that you have done prior to this. So, thank you so much for it. there are people, and there are people in this room who will never comprehend what it is like, what the sheer embarrassment that there is in having a leak during that period. And I just think the work that you're doing is fabulous in highlighting this. Like, just listening to you there, these simply aren't things that the teenage girl should have to be worrying about. There's enough going on. Especially at that age. And I know there are others here who have teenage girls who are going through this right now. I just want to pick up on the point I think it was the chair made around, you know, whether this should be guidance or should be in the legislation. I know you answered it, but I just want to, you know, I suppose share a concern that I would have if this was something that was just put into guidance, and that wording was just in guidance. There is always the concern that another minister could come in a number of years down the line and take it out of guidance or rewrite it. Is that something that you would have a concern over, that this, if it's not something that it was in the actual legislation, might at a time be able to be changed?
Absolutely. I think that's why I said in my response there, you know, we would primarily like it to be within a clause so that it was enforced, because schools need to be held to account. Even I see it with the period product provision of items. I sit in the Department of Education Steering Committee for the provision of free period products in schools as a kind of community voice. And we're up against those issues that some things are guidelines, some things about the placement of products, for example. And if that had been enforced where period products had to be in toilets, we wouldn't have all the kind of issues that we're having now. So I think, you know, for this to actually be meaningful and to actually have a better impact and to actually meet the needs of menstruators, where schools aren't left up to the kind of choice or discretion of what they do, we need to have it more kind of strictly in the clause rather than a guideline. So I would share your concern.
No, that's really good. Like, that's a practical example of where something maybe hasn't been in the legislation and has caused problems down the line. So I really, really appreciate that. No, listen, that's all I have, Katrina. Thanks a million. I really think that's a really important witness that we've had in today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words as well.
Thank you. Kathy, Cara, you were looking to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Katrina. Just to echo Kathy's words there, we're so grateful for all the work that you've done and the amount of times you've been to Stormont advocating for this issue and speaking up. As a woman, I thank you, and as a legislator, your work has undeniably shaped the period poverty bill. So very grateful to have you here today. You detailed really well there about the true cost of embarrassment when it comes to things like leaks and how that links in with the issue of affordability. So if a student leaks onto their skirt, they may have to buy a new skirt. It can lead to having to, you know, get rid of their tights, etc. And I think that is something at committee that maybe hasn't been highlighted as much as it probably should be until now, thanks to yourself. You touched there on the fact that, you know, we want to keep our young girls in sports and in the classroom, and the importance of dark materials. So I'm just wondering, as we're shaping this bill, in your opinion, do you think that we should mandate black trousers, or mandate the provision of choice for a black trouser? Because I know that the matter of choice, I think, is really important. And then with PE clothes as well, do you think we should be looking at some kind of language around mandating a black option? Just because, being a woman, I think the importance of choice, like we saw recently with the debate around camogues as well, the importance of choice and what women wear and what colour, given our cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think choice is definitely at the fore there, and it should be considered. I think dark colours, so navy browns and blacks. So there's a bit more of a choice and a bit more of a diversity in colours. But yeah, ultimately dark colours, and for us, I think as well in the bill, just more broadly. Obviously, I've kind of honed in today in clause 2, which just speaks to kind of our work a little bit more. But I think in general, consultation with young people, they're the ones wearing the uniform. I think we should, have this bill or policy or the school policies to be kind of somewhat co-produced. It's them wearing it, and obviously their comfort and their needs are definitely should be a priority. So, you know, putting it out to them if it's a navy or a brown or a black trouser, but agree that the choice in those colours is important.
Absolutely. And I think the period poverty bill covered, you know, the provision of products, but leaks are just inevitable and they're a part of life. So it's really important that we note that as a committee. And then just lastly, Katrina, while we have you, do you think the department is doing enough to monitor are young people who are staying off school because of menstruation or because of these kind of uniform related issues? Do you think they're doing enough from a data perspective to hone in on these issues and really recognise the severity of them?
I think definitely they could do more. It's difficult to kind of monitor it, and I'm sorry I don't have actual data for you guys. I just have kind of testimonies during the workshops where they feel quite comfortable with me because I'm an outsider of the organisation and they kind of open up. So I can only really speak to that, but it comes up quite a lot. And I think for me, especially when I was working with the GCSE and A-level students, when they said that even during their exams, that is on the back of their mind, that specific example from a few of them really kind of touched me because I just, you're already so stressed during that time. You should not have to be worried about your skirt or leaking during such a, important time in your life with your GCSE examinations. Now, that doesn't fully answer your question because you're talking a bit more about attendance in general. But I think, more feedback surveys where they are anonymized for young people to be able to say why or when they've taken time off school is probably a better way to get an insight into that rather than just discussions with someone who comes in from outside the organisation to kind of feed that back to you.
No, of course, that's really helpful, and I just think you're right. It's really important to listen to our young people, and I've spoken with some about bathroom breaks, and sometimes they've been denied access to the bathroom, particularly during exams. And you're right, if it's always in the back of our students' minds, they should be focusing on their studies, and it's not fair. So, look, that's all my questions. Thank you so much again for being here, and your briefing is so valuable, I think, to share with the committee just where young people's minds are at with this and how it impacts their learning. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Cara.
Thank you, Cara. Donny?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for the work that you've done. I suppose I want to touch on, following up from what Cara was saying, it's just go back to your survey, 98% would view comfort over school identity. I suppose I would argue and say if we dealt with comfort, then you can still have school identity anyway, because you wear your PE clothes, but that's taking pride in your school. See if we were to address the issue of how many branded items a school would have, and just with your engagement with our young people and parents, do you think that would help in bringing down the price of the school uniform?
Yeah, so for example, trousers don't need to be branded. If you have your crest on your jumper and your blazer, and I'm trying to think of the other, obviously the ties would be somewhat branded. You'd know the school colours, whereas the trousers wouldn't be branded. That, you can kind of get those trousers from anywhere, then that would be a great way of bringing down the price.
Yeah, and see, as far as the trousers and leggings, and I know it's very much a popular topic right now, especially for our young girls. I suppose the angle I want to go with this here is like, if they had the freedom, and I suppose the schools weren't being restrictive on how many items, would that address what Cara was saying around wider issues with school, as in not attending school? I'm bringing it because for me that this legislation could be much more than just about affordability. It could cover a lot of areas where we're seeing our young people disengaging from education.
Yeah, I would agree with kind of that, and I just think anything that we can do to keep children in the classroom engaged and not off school, and if that means having a bit of a uniform reform, then we should definitely be doing that.
Just last question, and just as society sort of changes as well, so I would feel it as more ideological that like people look at uniforms and go, and I'm not against uniforms by the way, but it's like it has to be a blazer, it has to be a jumper. The young people I talk to now are very much removed from that there, and would that be something you're picking up as well? They want to have pride in their school, there's no question about that there. They love their school and their identity and representing their school. But does it have to be in that blazer? Because that's the highest cost when you go to secondary schools.
Oh, absolutely. I went to Dominican College, Fort William, and I used to get B's on my report card if I did not wear my blazer. It's very strict in some of those schools, but they're so expensive. And I obviously, as I said, nearly reached about 2,000 schoolgirls last year going to different schools across NI. And I actually am seeing a lot of them wear PE gear during the workshops. I don't know if it's an option because it's a workshop and it feels like, it's not on the timetable, so kind of wear what you want and be comfortable. But I do see, especially in primary schools and secondaries, especially in the primary schools, less formality, especially there, but also in the secondary schools, the older you get in the year groups as well, I think there's a bit more leniency. And so I think it's definitely time for uniform reform. We're not back, years and decades ago where formality was at its core. Code of conduct was the most thing that you adhered to. We've moved beyond that. And I think, the excellent results that come out of NI are a testament to that as well. It's not, you don't have to wear certain formal uniform to get good grades or to have good behavior, and we don't ask any other workplace to wear suits, maybe lawyers and barristers and stuff. So why are we well, I don't know if you're nodding your head there, maybe up in Stormont or sometimes,
I'm
but
having trouble with that myself, but yeah, I take your point.
but I'm just thinking about we don't really do that as much anywhere else, and I don't know why we're asking children to do it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Danny might be bringing his own bill on the dress codes in the assembly at some point. Might be something we should all look out for.
I think I'll get Trina to help me.
Just picking up some ideas. Peter, if you want to come in there.
I love the fact, Danny, that you got that question on dress. Karina, thank you so much for your evidence this afternoon. And actually, the thing that's sort of stuck out to me, we've just been, I don't know whether you caught the earlier debate, but there's certainly the last couple of days, we've been talking a lot about the Claire Sugden Amendment and trousers for all and shorts instead of skirts. And it was just interesting hearing your evidence that from a different perspective, I think Claire was bringing it around the issues about upskirting and a whole range of things there. But just to hear your evidence around the fact that trousers would be incredibly useful to deal with some of the issues that you've highlighted today that girls face around menstruation. So that's something that I've taken away from what you've said. Look, I just wanted to pick up there one thing in your recommendation. In the briefing document we have, you talk about young people. You just used the phrase young girls. I was wondering why you didn't mention the word girls, because women are the ones who menstruate and boys don't. Is there a reason that you used the sort of language you did in terms of your briefing document?
Yes, we're going to have to agree to disagree there. So I don't want to get into a debate about this, but I think you know why I've used that, because we're inclusive of all genders, and we do believe that it's not just women who have periods. There's non-binary students and there's trans men as well, and us at Menstruation Matters are very clear about that. And even actually the legislation that's going through with free period products in all buildings, in selected buildings, and the policy in schools, we use inclusive language. So that mirrors that as well. It's consistent actually with legislation and policy in schools already.
Would you? I'll ask you one more question, seeing I have time. Would you agree with the statement that only biological females have periods?
I didn't realise I was coming on to a call today to get into this sort of debate. I thought we were actually going to be talking about uniforms. So yeah, I'm kind of going to push back on that one, because that's not why I'm here today.
And Katrina, if I could just come in there, I mean, I think you are here to give evidence on the school uniforms bill, and I don't think you need to feel any obligation to move outside of that particular area of evidence if you're not comfortable to do so. And I would maybe suggest that the member keeps questions focused to the bill itself.
I appreciate that, Chair. Thank you.
That's me, Chair.
No further questions.
No.
Okay. Michelle, you had indicated.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Katrina. I really had one question. I am sitting here in a pair of trousers, gasp. It's pretty normal for people to wear trousers, full stop. Do you think it's weird that people are pushing back on the fact that we would allow girls, or just generally for trousers to be available to anyone to wear in school?
Do I think it's weird that people are pushing back on that?
Yeah.
I think it's regressive. So yeah, I think it's something of the past. We don't we've moved on beyond that. We should just allow for students to have gender neutral uniforms, depending on their taste, even beyond periods. I would agree with trousers, so that people, not everyone feels very feminine. People prefer trousers for a particular style or taste, or to express themselves. And I know that has come up in your kind of meetings about self-expression being very important as well. So I would imagine that the people who are pushing back on trousers like formality and like tradition mostly. And I think
like controlling how young women wear, present themselves, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Katrina. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any further questions there? No. That's fine. So I think that's brought us to the end of the evidence session. So thank you for your time today, Katrina. I think that's been a really helpful briefing, and I think it's brought attention to a particular area in relation to the bill that we haven't covered before. So that's been very helpful today, and we thank you for your time and your input.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your time. Good luck
Thank
with
you.
the rest of the bill.
Thank
All
you.
right now, bye.
Okay, members, so that is the end of the evidence sessions on the school uniforms bill that are scheduled today. Now, we did have an item number 9 in the agenda where we were due to hear from the Department of Education, but the officials weren't available. I think it is a little disappointing that they're not available, in that we're looking next week to be going through our first look at a clause by clause run through the bill, and there may well have been questions that would have been very helpful to cover off with the department in relation to that, but hopeful they will be able to attend next week to facilitate that. I know when we went through the process of agreeing the length of time for the committee stage, we did get assurances from the Minister that there would be full engagement from the department on that, and they would make themselves entirely available to the committee. So I hope that for the remainder of the scrutiny time available, that is how things pan out, so that we can cover those issues in detail. So we don't have anything, we don't have the opportunity to engage with departmental officials today. But I think, given that we've heard substantial evidence over yesterday's session and today in relation to the school uniform bill, I'm very happy to open up to the floor for anything at all on any points where members may wish to seek any further clarity, either through the bill team in the department, via the bill clerk around potential amendments, or if there are any other comments that anybody wants to make that would inform our deliberations at this stage. I certainly have a couple of things I'd like to highlight, but maybe perhaps hand over to the clerk in the first instance. Is there anything specifically that you think that has been highlighted in terms of specific amendments? But if there's nothing specific in that regard, we can open up to members.
Yeah, I think yesterday there were some things that arose about the pre-loved uniform and how schools approach the school the uniform bank idea. Our last witness mentioned that she and people from her organisation had bought clothing and then found out that it was out of date already. Yeah. So I think there's something about the frequency of change of a school's policy, uniform policy, so that people can't be caught out having gone to some expense already and then needing to do that again, be it in the pre-loved or the new. I mean, I think the points were well made yesterday about the needs of girls to physical flexibility. There were some great examples of, acting that you would climb out a window, or needing to do some outdoor education in the nettles, and also active travel, so the environmental aspect of how you get to school and whether you can happily be on a bike without worrying that your skirt's going to get caught in the wheel. And so the safety aspect, so the young women who had the Trousers campaign had begun from the experience of going ice skating and having to the guidelines said we mustn't wear a skirt for safety reasons, and that kind of sparked this idea in their mind, where they hadn't thought of skirts from a safety point of view before. So safety, I think none of us had really thought. I hadn't. I don't know about you. Of safety as an aspect with skirts as well. Then gender neutrality came over. Has come over in a number of witnesses. Examples, not just from the point of view of flexibility, but also, if you have children who are going to different schools, and you have to buy an expensive blazer, and then you find that there's going to be a different blazer for the next child because it's a girl after a boy, rather than, that kind of indirect cost impact of gendered uniform is something that maybe might be worthy of consideration for amendment. Just even to cite, that indirectly these costs against young women may arise, because CMA today didn't say that they were aware of female uniforms being particularly more expensive, so it may be that it's more indirectly that they are rather than directly. Then, yeah, obviously there was discussion about how you might go about a cap, or how you might go about limiting the number of items, and there seems to be a preference from a number of perspectives on setting a limit on the number of items as being more practical, more flexible as an approach, less kind of binding in the sense of primary legislation, that you want it to be flexible. What else did we have? Then the so the committee has already been considering the idea of inclusivity and whether to decide particular categories on the face of the bill. And the last witness just now has asked that the committee maybe consider making an amendment about menstruating as a particular aspect of young people's lives that needs to be reflected. So that would be both. So you've already had ideas about neurodiversity in respect of the fabrics that are comfortable. Flexibility in respect of neurodiversity, so having open buttons or unrestrictive jumpers, or not wearing scratchy blazers, and so yeah, flexibility for that specific category of pupils, and then some racial and religious considerations were brought up by our witnesses yesterday as well, in terms of headscarves and non-fitting clothing. So, a preference that you can have options that aren't bodycon. So there's been a lot of reiteration, and I think consensus actually on some of those flexibility aspects, and also to reflect identity.
Okay.
Yeah, and early years. Yeah, and it's maybe more tangential. Some of those calendar issues, where if you think about a school year, parents are expected to provide uniform at a particular time, and then they're also expected to make voluntary contributions, which may or may not be like peer pressure, kind of have a peer pressure aspect attached. And then the fact that allocation of uniform grant is just once in the year, so maybe those calendar aspects are something that the committee could ask the department to consider, beyond, not on the face of the bill, but going forward. You mentioned something like that as well, Chair, that the department could consider in the wider sense. And then I think as well there's been a lot of discussion about punitive elements of uniform policy, and the committee might want to be quite prescriptive about the kind of behaviours associated with this, because it can be that people just can't afford, and they shouldn't be punished for not being able to afford a very tickety box set of clothing. So yeah, those are all.
So no, we have heard a lot of evidence over the last 2 days. There has been a lot. To maybe try and focus it in, and I'm happy to open this up to other members. I think we have, largely from the evidence yesterday from young people, I think the issue was probably that came through most clearly was around inclusivity, around choice in relation to trousers. There was quite a lot of discussion around the discipline aspect of it, and sort of what you do with uniform and for infractions of uniform policy. So I suppose on that side of the evidence, first of all, can I just check in with members? We are waiting for something back from the Bill's clerk in relation to a draft amendment around a potential inclusivity clause, and we have something around the play-based aspect of the curriculum access, and I think beyond that, and then we also have Claire Sugden's amendment. Are we content that covers the evidence we've heard in terms of what we would want to consider as to whether there are amendments we want to take forward, or is there anything else from the evidence we've heard that we might want to be taken forward? Probably again, earlier the engagement with the Bill's clerk, the better on these. So I'm happy to open that up. I mean, my sense is inclusivity clause, consideration of what committee might want to do in relation to the Claire Sugden amendment, and some of the other issue then around the play-based curriculum. To maybe broaden that out, there is the issue of the period awareness, which is probably the new element of the evidence. So it's again whether we want to have an amendment drafted in relation to that being on the face of the bill. So I'll open that conversation up. Danny?
Yeah, I was just wondering, if you look at Claire's amendment, and Pat really covered it really well yesterday, was it probably just needs even strengthened within itself, because it was a part of the evidence yesterday. I never really thought of it before. Was you talk about upskirting and you think of technology and a phone, but you actually don't need a phone to do upskirting and be intrusive. So that really sparked with me the importance of that the strengthening of that amendment itself. And there was just a couple of other wee things. I don't know if it falls into that, but it was just on back what the clerk was saying around the clothing banks. It was the quality of the clothing came up as well. So like something they put them on the shelves and they're not of good quality. I don't know how that would fit into it. But I thought our young people, just to finish it, were fantastic yesterday. Like she accepted her fate that she can't do sport. Like that should resonate with everybody. Like that's a disgrace. And then I think the answer, I think it was to Peter, if it's your only pair of gutties, you know. I think that's powerful testimonies coming from our young people, and it says very much that where the intentions of this legislation is to reduce costs, we must go much further. So we must.
Okay, so any other thoughts? Is there anything else, either by way of potential amendments or engagement with the department for clarification? Is there anything else at all? Is there
on the disciplinary? Is there something that you want to propose?
Yeah, well, I wanted to just check first of all on the evidence today for Menstruation Matters. Is there an interest in seeing a draft amendment around that being a requirement for policies to be period aware, David?
I felt that from that session today, that even in response to some of my own questions, that I forgot her name actually, Katrina. That Katrina seemed to think that now I know there's different motivations. Claire has different motivations, all the rest of it, but she seemed to sum up that look, if we got the trousers, that's a big law that sort of ticked. So I feel like even a lot of there's a long list there, and I understand, but for some of it does seem to come back. And I'm not advocating one way or the other here, but I think a lot of them were sort of saying the trousers was the issue that they're really on. It just seems to me that there's quite a lot of different motivations for putting that forward.
Yeah, no, I mean I think that it does seem trousers will cover a lot of the issues being raised by a number of stakeholders. Any other views on that in terms of a specific amendment, Kathy?
Just on it, like I get the trousers is will be a big part of it, but there's so much more. There's around tight fitting clothes. There's around having the flexibility to maybe wear PE gear if you are in the middle of your period and feeling really ill, really bloated, whatever it might be. So I think we should definitely explore something that's specific, and just the very fact that Katrina mentioned around other pieces of legislation that we're now facing problems down the line with because it wasn't tight enough. So I would feel very strongly that we should be exploring something more. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of these kids are they're at the very early stages of having periods. They're still learning, there's still a lot to go through, so I think there needs to be a real focus on awareness around that. So I think we should explore something around those.
I think Cara was just looking to come in there.
Yeah, just total agreement with Kathy. Even myself, just hearing Katrina's briefing today, I think it speaks to things like the tightness, how see-through a material is, how uncomfortable it can be. Maybe there's just a couple of technical factors we haven't really examined closely. So I don't know yet. I would be wholeheartedly behind making sure like language about period equality and dignity for our young people. Yeah.
Okay. So just to get at David, I think you're probably an alternative voice on this one. I
think my nervousness is about. I actually think I'm not that far away in terms of Kathy's motivation. In terms of even with SEN issues and so on, I personally think, and I understand there's outliers and there's examples, as you will get in many cases of people who haven't handled a circumstance well. But I think reasonable adjustments should be standard without it being in primary legislation. I have nervousness, I have to say, probably about this bill becoming like very very prescriptive about just about every measure we can think of, because what I fear that leads to is our schools being litigated against on a fairly regular basis, depending on, you know, a certain pupil wants to challenge to wear this or wear that, and it starts to get very difficult then. That is my genuine nervousness about that. I think reasonable adjustments for people who have different issues or health issues or saying or menstruation, you know, I think all of that should be taken into consideration someday. I just don't know if it needs to be or should be in primary legislation in that regard. And I think you'll always have outliers of bad examples, but I think they should be highlighted, not necessarily needed to be litigated in that sense.
And Peter, you'd wanted to come in there.
Yeah, no, I agree with David, and I agree with Kathy, and I would kind of hope that schools are doing that, are making those kind of reasonable adjustments, but I don't know, maybe they're not. That notwithstanding, the prescriptiveness of putting all this in through amendments into primary legislation, I am nervous about. The guidance should be where this is, and you know, notwithstanding, you can't. And I did hear the argument that you made about, well, what happens if another minister comes in and changes all this? But I don't think that can be a factor for how you produce primary legislation. You know, you can't double guess what a minister will do, because it is primary legislation and it will be there forever. So once we put something into a clause or it passes through the Assembly, that is it, and that is what guidance is really there for, to adjust and amend for the better. You know, the next minister will come along and actually go, well, actually this should be changed because this makes the situation better, not worse. So anyway, those are my feelings on it. I mean, I think on that particular issue that Kathy raised, I think we should probably wait for the guidance and see what's in the guidance. But you know, look, if the committee is minded to look at an amendment, fine with that. But that would be my general view on it.
And look, appreciate that really ultimately the decisions on this bill are going to be around how prescriptive we want primary legislation to be versus what's in the guidance, and that's kind of what we're navigating. So Michelle, yeah.
Well, just in the absence of the guidance,
Yeah,
perhaps we would have a look at what an amendment looked like, or take advice at least from the bill office and how this might work. We're not making a decision on it, we're just saying, you know what, we've had enough evidence today, I think we'd be minded to have a look at what that might look like, or let's say take advice from the bill office on the practicalities of amendment of that nature.
Given that I think the steer we're getting from the bill office is that earlier notice the better, I would be of the view there's no harm in taking advice and looking at a draft text. I imagine it's a fairly straightforward draft text to deliver, and it would then be for the committee to make a decision. So certainly not and I want to be clear, if I'm proposing amendments to be brought forward for a text that's not a statement of full committee endorsement of what that text looks like, it is just whether it would help us with our consideration. So kind of check if there's agreement on that, and if anyone does want to note that they're not content, that I think it's noted on the record as we are. So we are agreed to take that specific action forward. Okay. Very briefly, as again conscious of time, but I do think it's important we take some of this forward. You had mentioned just from your perspective, Clark, in relation to the disciplinary actions. You had said, was there something that you were suggesting we may want to explore?
Well, I just wondered. I think the provision at the moment says, what is it? It is clause 7.
Clause 7, yeah.
7.
Would sanction be within the scope of the bill in that respect?
Well, 7.7
in terms of
says,
disciplinary policies and so on, it feels like a different area.
It is, there is specific provision in the bill around disciplinary measures and participatory disadvantages.
Yeah, so that the department can give directions to the manager in relation to adherence to guidelines or disciplinary measures or participatory disadvantages, which is your exclusion or demerits, those things that they were talking about yesterday. So it doesn't say what that direction would be. Now, legal services are going to address that in their advice to the committee, which will come. You'll get it on the 12th, and it will be in oral evidence on the 18th. So just like how proportionate that might be. So it doesn't actually give a steer on the face of the bill. It just says that the department can give direction to schools about that. So maybe it'll be evident when the guidelines are in front of the
I guess
committee.
my thing as well
you
is
know.
you end up going
Yeah.
down. I actually, again, don't disagree with the principle. Some of the things have been raised that someone shouldn't be excluded, certainly shouldn't be excluded from a breakfast club because they turned up with makeup.
Or Brexit club for that matter.
Or Brexit club.
You're all weekend.
Yeah, but so I'm good. I think there's a difference between that and perhaps where the school has repeatedly outlined what their policy is on something, and there's a more of a rebellion, and you just push back against that on an ongoing basis.
By the school, yeah. I think that's
Yeah.
it.
So if there's a willful sort of breaking of the school rules around that, you then ask, well, what can the school do? Now we can get into what's reasonable, what's not, and I think that would take us down a different rabbit hole. But I think that's my thing is that there should be a. I didn't like the word demerit yesterday, but I could understand what that system was. That was about sort of being very soft and saying, look, you're not going to be punished this time, but if this is an ongoing thing, then there might be an issue. But
I would. Oh, sorry. Do you want to come in, Danny? I think Sir Peter had indicated first. I was going to maybe just suggest a way through this one, but
yeah. So just on that, if we take a step back and think, what is the bill meant to do? So the bill's meant to make sure that costs come down for parents as they send their kids to school. And how's the bill going to do that? It's probably going to do that through non-branded items, and whatever items that are bought as part of a school uniform are cheaper. I think the clause that the clerk just read out is talking about when children, as an example that I gave to the Children's Commissioner yesterday, and to share what his answer was, but a kid comes in branded items, right, which is completely contrary. The whole idea is to make sure that the uniform is uniform and cost effective. So whenever that child starts to come in Christian Dior or Nike Air trainers or whatever, what happens? Something has to happen, because otherwise it flies in the face of everything that the bill is trying to do, which is trying to make sure that kids are the same and that parents don't feel the pressure to have to conform to a kid who's bringing in expensive trainers. Is that not right?
They're not being forced by those trainers.
Maybe not trainers, but t-shirts or
certain items of uniform.
Yeah, well, it could be cookery. It could be cookery or Canterbury tracksuit bottoms, and then there will be other children in the class who'll go, think, well, I need to get those because that child's got them. That's why we're having the bill. So there's not that sense of competition, and that kids feel that they need to get to a certain standard in terms of the branded items that they wear. Surely that's the point of it.
And I do understand that. I think possibly if we're going to get back to the text of the bill, clause 7 that we're referring to is actually about when the department directs a school because they have failed to adhere to the guidelines. And now that may be if they've failed to adhere to guidelines in relation to participatory discipline. So I would suggest we might. I'm going to, Dana, if you want to come in.
I'm not overly distracted, but Peter, that's good down a hypothetical of not really what you're trying to do with the bill, really. But the point I was going to make around the discipline, he said the one that really jumped out for me was children with SEN who haven't been assessed or haven't got their diagnosis. That to me was the glaring thing, and then they're being demerted. That needs to be addressed. I don't know how it's done. So I went home last night. I was racking my brain to try and think of my own amendment, what you could do to address that. Haven't come up with it yet, and I would like to actually hear from legal and maybe even the bill staff to say how do we be very specific around.
We have the bill clerk here next week, so perhaps that's one to raise there. I was going to suggest around some of this stuff at clause 7 around the participatory aspect of this and the issues around directions when schools fail to adhere to the guidelines. It may be prudent to wait for the legal advice that we're coming through, and in terms of what those directions really mean, the legal authority that they have, and then we can maybe frame our thinking at that stage, or for the guidelines, to see what's in there.
I think we can't see the full picture of that.
Are we content to wait on that? But on that point, do we know, have we any steer of when they're coming? I think that the department said end of this week. Was it end of this week? So we're hoping to receive that. Shall we? Okay. Are we content with that, or are there alternative views? Michelle, I wasn't sure if you were indicating there. No.
I just think, when can we get legal advice? Is it after the deadline?
We will have it in writing next week, and then an oral briefing on the 18th, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. The other thing then, just again, I know we are at 5 o'clock, but issue around cost. So we've talked a lot around the inclusion, trousers, that aspect which came through very strongly. Cost obviously was a much bigger focus today in terms of our evidence sessions. The two aspects to it are obviously we have the cost cap and the branded items cap, or those clauses 3 and 4. I'll just sort of go full disclosure here in relation to clause 4. I have engaged with the Bill Clerk around a potential amendment on that, not in terms of enacting that power, but putting in some form of accountability mechanism in where the Minister is required to report on the impact of the bill and its impact on reducing costs, and to outline rationale to the Assembly around the introduction or not of a cap and what the reasoning is for that. I think there does seem to be some nervousness around potential unintended consequences of a cap. We haven't, as far as I can tell, got the preparatory work in place to just say let's go and activate that. Would members be open? I'm very content to share the wording that the Bill Clerk has drafted for me in terms of what some sort of accountability mechanism might be. Is that something that, if I was to share that in advance of next week, I'm happy to feed that into the
only thing initially I would look clarity on, Chair, is the accountability to ensure this is about bringing down costs from where they are currently. There'll be a plateau of what is probably a adjustable plateau of what is reasonable in that regard. So I'm just sort of thinking accountability of Minister. I don't think the job of the bill is to reduce and keep at a reasonable level the cost of uniforms, not to an ever decreasing screw on that, which to a point where it becomes unskilled.
I understand.
So
I mean, presented from a reasonable perspective, essentially a mechanism to have an accountability engagement with the Assembly around the purpose of the bill is to bring costs down.
I'm just thinking a future minister, it might not be from my party, could well just be lambasted continually for not ever. It's never low enough, and that's my sort of thinking. But yeah, I
understand. I mean, again, for consideration, I'm if members are content, I will through the clerk share that for tabling for next week. On branded items, is there any thinking that's clearly emerging here around anything that would want to be done either by way of amendment elsewhere or at clause 3 in relation to branded items? It seems to be coming through very clearly in evidence that seems to be a lot of stakeholder sense that is where the practical, pragmatic intervention could come. I'm happy to leave it at that. We may want to raise that with the Bill Clerk unless there is something specific that any member wants to raise at this stage.
I think you're spot on. I think that's come through very clear around how you address the cost and the cap.
That's certainly my sense from today's evidence
I think we're
session.
going to be very, sort of work out what exactly we mean by branded, and then what that looks like. I don't think we should. I know there's a figure in England, but I don't think we should just pluck a figure from the air necessarily either. I'm not saying against. I just sort of think that. I'm thinking back to really all I'm doing is thinking back to my old school uniform myself. You could say the tie, you could say the blazer. We had actually a very generic PE kit of a plain blue t-shirt, plain white shorts, but we did have a rugby shirt, and a rugby shirt probably looked like it had been designed in the 1950s, but it was more rugged because of the nature of the. So just so long as we don't. 3 might be a reasonable number, 4 might be a reasonable number, but it's. I think we have to give due consideration to. If you're going to do that, what works for schools as well, and it's not just picking a figure.
Well, perhaps for picking up with both the Bill team and the Bill Clerk next week in terms of where even in the department's consultation on that. But I'll leave it at that stage. Is there anything else anyone wants to raise around anything else to take forward at this stage? Appreciate it's been a lot of evidence to process, and there's also a benefit to just letting some of that filter through in between now and next week. We can do that. Okay, then members, if we're agreed with those agreed actions to move on then to item 10, which is a small amount of correspondence has come through today. So I'll draw members' attention in their packs to pages 45 to 105, 6 items under correspondence, plus I think there was an item of tabled correspondence which was potentially for there is a couple of table bits which we'll come to. So summary note is included at page 45. I'll run through anything that just needs a committee discussion or decision. So item 10.2 on page 46, it's correspondence from the Think 1265 campaign on teacher workload, and they're seeking a meeting with committee. clearly not before recess, but I would be very open to hearing from this group. They've done quite wide-ranging surveys of teachers around the issue of workload, so it's a live consideration. So I mean, I would be content to invite them to committee if members are agreed. Agreed. Item 10.3 on page 47, it's correspondence from Fermanagh and Omagh District Council seeking a meeting with the committee to present data analysis on its area relating to work of the committee. Wasn't entirely clear to me from the letter what they wanted to present on specifically. So I mean, I would want to suggest that they would be welcome to send in a written briefing on the areas they want to discuss. Yeah. But our work programme is under pressure, so I think when there's a lack of clarity, I would be content with that if members are agreed. Agreed. Item 10.4 on page 48, it's correspondence from the Department of Education. It's a written paper on the proposal for legislation to provide for all learners to participate in education until age 18. We did discuss this in a fair amount of detail actually at our concurrent committee meeting with Economy. Again, likely to be post-recess, but are we content to seek an oral briefing on the matter? Important one to engage on if we're agreed. And then other than that, we have a tabled papers item 10.8, an invite from the IAF to their summer afternoon tea on the 24th of June. I think that's a note for diaries if members are agreed. As nice as it sounds, a plenary sitting might clash with that. I think it's a plenary day, perhaps I've got that wrong. And then item 10.9, correspondence from the clerk to the Assembly and Executive Committee on a review of committee engagement on cross-cutting strategies. Do you want to speak to that briefly in terms of how we might wish to respond to that letter from the ERA clerk?
Yeah, that's from Assembly and Executive Review, although I understand that CLG was also looking at this, so I'm just going to check out the lines of engagement on that. But it's basically to gather experience of using the allocation methods that are in standing orders currently for cross-cutting matters. So whether you have the two chairs meet and decide who's going to take the lead, or whether you arrange a concurrent meeting, and the utility of those arrangements. So does anybody have any strong feelings, like for example from your experience of concurrent meetings of the committee, that you want to reflect?
I wonder is this one to maybe take away and table as a future item just to give members some time to reflect on it. It doesn't need a response to September, so I would be content given the time to maybe park this one, and if members, if when an agenda allows, to table it for a bit of discussion. I think having had two concurrent meetings fairly recently, there probably are reflections that are worth bringing to bear on that, but perhaps for another meeting.
So I'll do a kind of draft and bring it back.
That'll be great.
You can add to it.
Thank you. Okay. Other than those items, are members content to dispose of correspondence as per the note at page 45? Agreed. Great. Okay. Item 11 is the forward work programme, and I think it should be fairly self-explanatory where we're at. Where it's largely as per sort of scrutiny of the bill and really bringing ourselves to the point of agreeing the draft report. Happy to bring the clerk in if you do want to speak to it. The two things I just want to highlight in terms of future meetings is really just to draw attention, not agreed as yet, but we potentially on the 18th of June have we're seeking an engagement with Lucy Crane around the curriculum review, and then it was agreed last week, I think, or the week before, that an update from the EA as we approach the summer around placements would be opportune on the 25th of June, but we are seeking clarity on that. Other than that, it will all be bill related, I would say, in the main. So I don't know if there's anything to add to that in terms of
so those requests have gone in and we're trying to arrange those briefings, and you know, should it emerge that the committee needs more time to deliberate on the bill, then we can maybe postpone those as we get closer to them. The other thing is that the British Heart Foundation are coming in on Wednesday at lunchtime, just to highlight that. That's 12 to 2 on the 11th. Is that in here, Mark, or the visitors restaurant? So that's where it's an opportunity to do CPR and hear from first responders.
And that links in with the programme of CPR, role of the defibrillators in school being rolled out, and the curriculum interventions around CPR. So I think that would be a good one to engage with. So it would be good for members to attend. Peter?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the clerk for the work on this one. I've got two questions. One is, can we, and I again might have missed this, but have we got a list of stakeholders that the committee wrote out to in terms of engagement on the school uniforms bill? And could that, if it hasn't been circulated, could it be?
Certainly, yeah. So we had an initial list of our core stakeholders, and then research gave us an additional list. And actually, they were to come back with another inclusion list, but unfortunately, they haven't yet. So, yeah, but I can let you know.
That'd be useful. Just then on next week's committee, in terms of legislation, we've got the Women's Support Network and Environmental 80.
Yes.
So, was this person on the stakeholders list?
No, so just in respect of the various strands of the bill, this was someone who could talk about the sustainability aspect potentially. So I reached out to like Repair Cafe and people like that, and no one replied. And Environmental 80 was interested in coming along.
Okay.
So, is that all right?
And then just to remind members that we'll be doing our first run through a clause by clause consideration, probably in closed session, just to give members the opportunity to discuss in as much detail as we wish in terms of any areas of potential amendment or any clauses that there are particular concerns with. Other than that, are we content to agree the forward work plan as drafted?
Yep.
Agreed. Item 12 is any other business. Is there any other business? No. So item 13, date, time and place of next meeting, and that's scheduled for Wednesday the 11th of June, 2 p.m, room 29 and online here in Parliament Buildings. And I just will put the question in, the committee meeting does now adjourn. Are we agreed? Agreed. Great.